A gold-capped tooth sits inside a small box. It is not a crown, not a medal, not a ceremonial object. It is a fragment of a man whose body was deliberately destroyed after he was executed in the Congo. The man was Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the newly independent Republic of the Congo. The tooth was returned to his family in 2022, more than 60 years after his death. For decades, it was held in Belgium by Gerard Soweté, a police official who later confessed that he had helped dispose of Lumumba's remains. The body was gone. The grave was gone. The official story was broken. But the tooth survived. To understand why anyone would dissolve a body, we have to begin with what a body can become after death. A grave can become a monument. A monument can become a gathering place. A gathering place can become a political movement. Lumumba's enemies did not only fear what he might do alive, they feared what his death might mean.
That is the part sanitized history keeps trying to remove. They did not destroy the body because the body was irrelevant. They destroyed it because the body was evidence. Evidence of who had custody. Evidence of where the execution happened. Evidence that the former colonial power had not simply watched a Congolese tragedy from a distance.
The broad facts are firmly established. Lumumba was captured, transferred to Katanga, executed on January 17, 1961, alongside Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, and then subjected to a deliberate effort to conceal and destroy the remains. But some of the most vivid details come from later testimony, especially Soweté's confession. Those details must be identified as testimony and reconstruction, not treated as though every moment was independently filmed or documented.
And that distinction is not academic decoration. If a detail is uncertain, say it is uncertain. The documented story is already devastating. We do not need to improve it with facts the evidence cannot carry.
The official story once suggested that Lumumba had been killed by Congolese enemies, acting inside an internal conflict. That explanation contained a narrow truth. Congolese actors did participate. Katangan authorities received the prisoners. Local forces carried out the immediate violence. But the explanation concealed the larger chain. Belgian officials intervened in the Congo after independence. Belgian economic interests were tied to Katanga. American intelligence officers planned to remove Lumumba and supported the military forces that isolated him. The United Nations, invited to defend Congolese sovereignty, refused to restore Lumumba's authority and failed to prevent his capture. Then a former prime minister was delivered to the territory of his enemies. No public trial, no safety guarantee, no body returned to the family. Only a tooth.
If stories about buried decisions and the people forced to live with their consequences pull you in, stay with us. This is exactly the kind of history we investigate here.
The central question is not simply who pulled the trigger. That question matters, but it is too small to contain the crime. Who made Lumumba vulnerable? Who tracked his escape? Who supported the coup that removed him? Who allowed his political status to become irrelevant? Who transferred him to Katanga? Who knew the destination was dangerous? Who benefited when the nationalist prime minister disappeared? The evidence does not give us one perfect villain and one surviving document that explains everything. It gives us a chain. Belgian political intervention, Congolese military rivalry, CIA covert action, a UN policy that treated sovereignty as a problem of neutrality, a transfer described as logistics, an execution carried out in a remote clearing, a cover-up designed to eliminate the grave. The final written order from Washington or Brussels has never been established with the certainty that popular retellings often claim. The evidence of a CIA assassination plot is real. The evidence of Belgian responsibility is real. The evidence of Belgian personnel at the execution and the destruction of the bodies is real. The precise final command remains disputed. That uncertainty does not make the story less horrifying. It makes the story more revealing, because covert power is often designed so that responsibility can be distributed until no one person appears to own the outcome.
The strongest conclusion is not that one government performed every act. It is that multiple actors made decisions that converged on the same result. Lumumba was isolated, captured, transferred, killed, and erased.
And the strongest historical claim is the one that survives the gaps. We may never know who spoke the final order. We know who created the conditions in which the order could be carried out.
In the chapters ahead, we will return to the beginning, to a postal clerk from the Kasai region, to a political organizer who learned how colonial power worked, to the beer halls, streets, and meetings where a national movement began to form. We will follow Lumumba into the Palais de la Nation, where he challenged Belgium in front of its king. We will watch the army mutiny 5 days after independence. We will trace the secession of Katanga, the arrival of UN peacekeepers, the Soviet trucks and aircraft, the CIA poison plot, and Mobutu's coup. Then we will follow Lumumba into the rain, toward Stanleyville, toward the Sankuru River, toward the decision that may have placed family above freedom, and finally, toward Katanga, toward 943, toward the acid, toward the tooth. The man who wanted the Congo to control its own wealth was turned into a prisoner. The prisoner was turned into a transfer. The transfer became an execution. The execution became a cover story. And the cover story survived for decades, until one small piece of gold returned from Belgium to the country that had been denied the rest of him. The tooth is not the whole truth. It is the part of the truth they failed to destroy. Before Patrice Lumumba became a prime minister, before his name was spoken in diplomatic cables as a threat, before foreign intelligence officers discussed how to remove him, he was a young Congolese man trying to make a life inside a system designed to keep him permanently subordinate. He was born in 1925 as Isaiah Tasumbu Tawosa in Onalua, in the Kasai region of the Belgian Congo. Later, he would adopt the name Patrice Emery Lumumba. The name changed. The structure around him did not. Belgian colonial rule divided Congolese people by education, status, ethnicity, profession, and proximity to European authority. A small number of Africans could become what the colonial administration called évolués, educated or evolved. Africans, permitted to occupy a narrow space between the European rulers and the millions they governed. That space came with privileges. It also came with a ceiling.
The first mistake is to imagine Lumumba appearing suddenly, fully formed, as the great nationalist of 1960. He was not born into power. He spent years learning exactly how power worked by being denied access to it.
And we should be precise about the biography. The broad outline is well established. He received mission education, worked in the colonial postal system, and later became involved in politics. But the popular version often turns every stage into a neat, heroic progression, as if the future leader was simply waiting for history to recognize him. History is usually less tidy. Lumumba was ambitious. He wanted education, mobility, respect, and a better position within the colonial order. Like many educated Africans of the period, he initially tried to navigate the system rather than destroy it.
Which matters because it makes the transformation more interesting. If we begin with the assumption that he was always a revolutionary, we lose the actual evidence of radicalization. What changed him? Was it one prison sentence? A series of humiliations? The limits placed on educated Africans? Or did he simply recognize that colonial society could offer him personal advancement but never genuine equality?
The answer is probably cumulative. There was no single cinematic moment when a switch flipped.
In the 1950s, the Belgian Congo was entering a period of political acceleration. Across Africa, the colonial order was beginning to fracture. Ghana became independent in 1957. The Bandung Conference had announced a new language of anti-colonial solidarity. Leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah were arguing that political independence without economic independence was a fraud. But the Belgian Congo remained tightly controlled. The colony was rich in copper, uranium, diamonds, cobalt, and agricultural resources. Its roads, mines, companies, schools, and administrative institutions were built to serve extraction. Congolese political participation was limited, managed, and often treated as a problem of gradual education. The official argument was that independence could come later, after the Congolese had been prepared. The practical meaning was simpler. Belgium would decide when the Congolese were ready to govern themselves.
And the word ready was doing a lot of political work. It was not a neutral measurement. Belgium controlled the institutions that supposedly proved Congolese unpreparedness. If Congolese people had limited access to higher education, Belgium could point to the shortage of educated Congolese. If African political parties were restricted, Belgium could point to the lack of stable parties. If the army remained commanded by Europeans, Belgium could point to the lack of Congolese officers. The system produced the weakness it then used to justify its own continuation.
That is the trick of colonial rule. First, you prevent people from governing. Then you call their exclusion evidence that they cannot govern.
Lumumba entered adulthood inside that contradiction. He worked as a postal clerk in Stanleyville, now Kisangani. The postal service offered more than a wage. It exposed him to correspondence, administration, movement, and the machinery of the colonial state. It also placed him in contact with people across regions and social classes. Then came imprisonment. The details of the case are often simplified in biographies, but the broad fact is documented. Lumumba was convicted of embezzlement and spent time in prison during the mid-1950s. The sentence damaged his reputation. It also changed his political outlook.
We need to resist the temptation to turn imprisonment into a moral cleansing ritual. He was not sent to prison because Belgium discovered a future liberator and wanted to forge him through suffering. He was imprisoned because of a criminal conviction. But prison can alter a person's relationship to authority. Lumumba encountered the colonial state not as an abstract administrator, but as an institution that could strip him of status, movement, and dignity.
And there is a second point. Later nationalist movements often rehabilitate the difficult parts of a leader's past. The convicted clerk becomes the misunderstood intellectual. The ambitious employee becomes the pure patriot. We should not erase the ambition. His ambition was part of his political energy.
Agreed. The evidence suggests a man who wanted advancement and recognition, but who increasingly concluded that personal advancement within the colonial system could not solve the larger problem.
When Lumumba emerged from prison, he did not retreat from public life. By 1957, he had moved to Leopoldville, the colonial capital, and found work connected to Congo, a beer company. This is where one of the most vivid parts of his political biography begins. Not in a parliament, not in a military academy, in the distribution networks of a beer company. Lumumba worked as a sales director associated with Polar Beer. The job brought him into contact with bars, shopkeepers, transport workers, clerks, laborers, and neighborhood organizers. These were places where Congolese people could gather with less direct supervision than in formal political meetings. The beer network did not create the independence movement by itself, but it gave Lumumba access to people and conversations that colonial restrictions made difficult to reach through conventional politics.
This is the part that makes the story structurally important. Organization is not always built in official offices. Under authoritarian or colonial systems, people use whatever networks are available: churches, workplaces, unions, sports clubs, cafes, transport routes, even commercial distribution. The colonial state saw a beer salesman. Lumumba saw a communications infrastructure.
And the people in those bars were not waiting for a lecture on constitutional theory. They were dealing with wages, racial humiliation, police authority, housing, and the knowledge that the wealth leaving their country was not improving their lives. That is where nationalism becomes real, not in the speech first, in the daily insult.
So the beer route gave him reach. What gave him a national message?
The answer is the Movement National Congolais, the MNC, founded in 1958. Unlike parties built primarily around a single region or ethnic constituency, the MNC presented itself as a national movement. That distinction was crucial in a country as large and diverse as the Congo. The colonial government had encouraged forms of political organization that could be contained through local leaders and regional divisions. A movement claiming to speak for the entire Congo posed a different kind of threat.
The Congo was not one political community in any simple sense. It contained dozens of major ethnic and linguistic groups, multiple regional economies, and colonial boundaries imposed over older systems of authority. Belgian policy did not invent every division, but it governed through them. A politician who built a narrow regional base could be negotiated with, isolated, or balanced against rivals. A politician who claimed the loyalty of the entire country was more difficult to manage. Lumumba understood this. In December 1958, he represented the MNC at the All-African People's Conference in Accra, Ghana. There he encountered a wider anti-colonial world, one in which independence was not a distant administrative gift, but an international political demand. Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana offered a model: political freedom tied to continental solidarity and economic control. Lumumba returned from Accra with a larger vocabulary and a larger ambition. He was no longer speaking only about the rights of Congolese citizens inside Belgian institutions. He was speaking about the Congo as part of Africa's liberation.
Accra expanded the scale of the problem. Before that, Lumumba could be understood as a Congolese politician challenging Belgian administrators. After Accra, he was operating inside a Pan-African network. That changed how Belgium and the United States could interpret him. A local nationalist might be managed. A nationalist connected to Nkrumah, anti-colonial movements, and a continent-wide political project could be treated as a geopolitical risk.
But we should be careful with the word Pan-Africanist. It describes an important influence, but it does not mean Lumumba abandoned Congolese national politics for an abstract continental ideology. His central project remained the unity and sovereignty of the Congo.
Exactly. His nationalism was expansive, but it was not vague. He wanted a unified Congolese state capable of controlling its own political and economic direction.
In October 1959, Lumumba was arrested after unrest in Stanleyville. Belgian authorities accused him of inciting violence. He was imprisoned again. This time, the political consequences were different. The colonial administration believed arrest could remove a disruptive figure from the approaching independence negotiations. Instead, imprisonment made Lumumba harder to dismiss. His supporters could present him as a man punished for demanding freedom. His absence became evidence that the colonial government feared his presence, and the political timetable was accelerating. Belgium had not prepared a large Congolese governing class capable of replacing the colonial administration. It had not created a fully African officer corps. It had not transferred control over the economic system that made the Congo valuable. Yet independence was approaching. The contradiction was becoming impossible to hide.
They wanted independence without surrendering command. They wanted Congolese flags over Belgian structures, Congolese politicians over Belgian economic power, and Congolese soldiers still taking orders from European officers. That is not a transition. That is a costume change.
It is also worth asking whether the Belgian government genuinely believed it could manage the process. Not every failure requires a master plan. Governments can be arrogant, divided, and incompetent at the same time. Belgium may have expected a controlled transfer and simply miscalculated how quickly political expectations would rise.
Miscalculation does not make the consequences innocent.
No, but it changes the explanation. If we describe every colonial disaster as perfectly engineered, we create a story that is emotionally satisfying but historically weak.
That is the correct challenge. The evidence does not require us to choose between total design and total accident. There can be a system designed to preserve control, officials improvising within it, and decisions producing consequences nobody fully anticipated.
That mixed explanation fits the record better.
By the time Lumumba was released, the man returning to politics was no longer merely an educated African seeking recognition from the colonial state. He had become a national organizer with international connections, a public speaker capable of reaching urban crowds, and the leader of a movement that claimed the Congo belonged to its people as one political unit. That claim threatened several interests at once. It threatened Belgian officials who wanted a gradual transition. It threatened regional politicians who preferred greater autonomy or control over local resources. It threatened foreign companies that depended on stable access to mines. And it threatened foreign governments that viewed every nationalist movement through the lens of the Cold War. But in early 1960, none of that was yet settled. The Congo was still moving toward elections. The MNC was competing with rival parties. Belgium was still negotiating the terms of withdrawal. Lumumba had not yet become prime minister. He was simply one of the men trying to define what independence would mean before someone else defined it for him.
And that is the first major shift in the story. The question is not whether Lumumba wanted independence. Everyone entering the political arena had to claim some version of it. The question is what kind of independence he meant.
For Lumumba, independence was not only the replacement of Belgian administrators with Congolese administrators. It involved political unity, national dignity, and control over the resources that made the Congo valuable to the world. That program was still being formed, but its direction was clear.
And the people watching him understood the economic implication. If the Congo became politically unified and economically sovereign, then its mineral wealth could become the foundation of a state rather than the guarantee of foreign access. That is why the story cannot be reduced to personality. Lumumba mattered because he represented a possible rearrangement of ownership.
In May 1960, the MNC performed strongly in the legislative elections. The result did not make Lumumba an all-powerful president. The constitutional system produced a complicated arrangement in which Joseph Kasavubu became president and Lumumba became prime minister through the parliamentary process. The government was a coalition. Its institutions were fragile. Its army remained under a colonial command structure. Its treasury and economy were deeply tied to foreign interests. Its regional rivals were already preparing for the struggle ahead. But Lumumba had reached the center of power. The postal clerk had become the man tasked with governing a country Belgium had ruled for decades and prepared for only weeks. The independence ceremony was scheduled for June 30. Belgium expected ceremony, gratitude, and restraint. Lumumba was about to decide whether the first words of the new Congo would reassure the people who had ruled it or confront them.
And we should not say the speech alone made him a target. That is too neat. The target was already forming through his political program, his national reach, and the economic stakes surrounding the Congo. The speech made the conflict public.
Yes, it transformed private anxiety into an international image.
He did not create the danger by speaking. He refused to hide it.
The next chapter begins inside the Palais de la Nation, beneath the heat of an independence ceremony designed to make colonial power look generous. A king will speak, a president will speak. Then Lumumba will take the microphone. And for the first time, the world will hear the argument that Belgium most wanted to keep outside the room. The Congo was independent. The question was whether independence would belong to the Congolese. June 30th, 1960. Leopoldville is crowded, humid, and expectant. The city has been renamed Kinshasa, but for this moment it is still Leopoldville in the language of the departing colonial power. Belgium has ruled the Congo for decades. Now, beneath the flags and ceremonial uniforms, the rulers are preparing to hand over a country they do not intend to surrender completely. The ceremony is designed to make independence look orderly. King Baudouin of Belgium arrives to represent the monarchy. Joseph Kasavubu, the incoming president, is expected to speak for the new republic. Patrice Lumumba, the incoming prime minister, is present as the leader of the parliamentary majority. The script is already written. Belgium will be praised for its civilizing mission. The Congolese will express gratitude. The empire will leave looking generous. Then Lumumba takes the microphone.
The popular version of this moment is that Lumumba simply interrupted the ceremony and delivered an unscheduled speech. That is broadly true, but the political meaning is more precise. He did not merely break protocol. He challenged the story the ceremony had been built to tell.
And we need to separate the documented event from the later mythology. Lumumba did deliver a speech that directly confronted Belgian colonial rule. He described forced labor, racial discrimination, humiliation, and violence. The speech was not invented later. It exists in written and recorded forms. But the claim that this single speech instantly caused Belgium, the United States, and every Western power to decide on assassination is too simple. Hostility toward Lumumba had deeper roots.
Exactly. If we say he gave one speech and signed his death warrant, we turn a structural conflict into a morality play about one moment of personal defiance. The speech mattered enormously, but it mattered because the political conflict already existed.
Before Lumumba spoke, King Baudouin praised the legacy of Leopold II. Leopold had ruled the Congo Free State as his personal possession from 1885 until 1908. His regime became associated with forced labor, hostage-taking, mutilation, mass death, and the violent extraction of rubber. In 1908, international pressure forced the Belgian state to take control of the territory, which became the Belgian Congo. The transfer changed the legal administration. It did not erase the history. Baudouin's speech presented Belgian rule as a project of development and order. He praised the achievements of Leopold II and described independence as the culmination of Belgium's work. The message was unmistakable. Belgium had built the Congo, educated its people, and now generously permitted them to inherit it. For many Congolese listeners, that was not a history lesson. It was an insult, delivered in ceremonial language.
Imagine being told that the power standing in front of you is the reason you are free. That is the emotional violence of the speech. The colonizer presents the end of colonial rule as a gift, and the people who endured the rule are expected to applaud the giver.
But we should also recognize why ceremonies use flattering language. States do not usually organize independence celebrations to conduct historical trials. Baudouin was speaking as a monarch defending national legitimacy. That does not make the speech accurate. It explains why the ceremony was designed that way.
And it explains why Lumumba had to break it.
It explains why he chose to break it. It does not prove that every later consequence was predictable.
Kasai spoke first for the Congolese side. His address was formal and conciliatory. He thanked Belgium and emphasized cooperation between the two countries. The tone matched what Belgian officials wanted. Then Lumumba rose. The exact staging of the moment has been retold many times. Some accounts describe him as taking the microphone without being invited. Others emphasize that, as Prime Minister, he had a legitimate place in the ceremony, even if his remarks were not part of the approved program. The important point is not whether he physically stole the microphone. The important point is that he seized control of the meaning of independence.
This is where the title becomes useful. The stolen microphone is not a claim that Lumumba literally snatched a piece of equipment from someone's hands. It describes a struggle over who had the right to define what the ceremony meant.
And the speech itself is remarkably direct. Lumumba does not thank Belgium for delivering freedom. He says the freedom was won through struggle. He recalls the humiliations of colonial rule. He speaks of forced labor, unequal treatment, contempt, and violence. He addresses the Congolese people as citizens, not subjects.
Lumumba's language is not cautious. He says independence was achieved through a struggle. He says the Congolese had endured humiliating slavery imposed by force. He says they had been paid low wages that did not permit dignified lives. He describes Africans as being judged by the color of their skin and subjected to laws that favored Europeans. He does not describe colonial rule as a difficult but necessary education. He describes it as domination. The speech is not a call for revenge. It is a demand that the new nation remember what independence has cost.
That distinction matters. Lumumba's speech is often presented as pure emotion, but it is also a political document. He is establishing the moral basis of the new state. The Congo is not independent because Belgium decided to be benevolent. The Congo is independent because Congolese people organized, resisted, endured imprisonment, and forced the issue. That changes the implied ownership of the country. If independence is a Belgian gift, Belgium can expect gratitude and continued influence. If independence is a Congolese victory, then the Congolese government has the right to renegotiate the entire relationship,
Including the economic relationship.
especially the economic relationship.
The Belgian state was leaving the Congo with its flag lowered, but its economic position remained powerful. Belgian companies controlled major sectors of the economy. European settlers occupied most senior administrative and technical roles. The army remained dominated by white officers. The country had very few Congolese university graduates, very few senior administrators, and almost no Congolese officers at the top of the military command. Independence transferred legal authority faster than it transferred practical capacity. The new republic inherited institutions shaped to serve colonial priorities. That is why the ceremony could be both genuine and deceptive. The Congo was becoming a sovereign state. But sovereignty without control over administration, security, and resources was dangerously incomplete.
And that is the point where I want to push back against the language of Belgium granted independence. Belgium did transfer power under pressure, and the transfer was real. But granted makes the process sound voluntary and benevolent. The timing was also self-protective. Belgium could leave before a more radical movement became impossible to manage, while preserving economic and strategic relationships.
That interpretation is supported by the institutional facts, but we should not assume every Belgian official shared one unified plan. There were divisions within Belgium, there were divisions among Congolese political leaders, there were genuine negotiations and genuine uncertainty. The system was not controlled by one perfectly coordinated mind.
No, but a system does not need one mind to protect the same interests. Different officials can improvise, disagree, and still converge on the preservation of economic access. That is how power often survives transition. It does not require everyone to share the same motive. It requires enough people to reject the same threat.
And Lumumba was becoming that threat, not because he had an army, not because he had a Soviet ideology, because he was telling ordinary Congolese people that independence meant they could question the ownership of the country.
The reaction inside the ceremony was immediate. Congolese delegates responded with enthusiasm. Belgian officials were visibly uncomfortable. The atmosphere shifted from ceremonial confidence to political exposure. The speech was broadcast and circulated. For Congolese listeners, it offered something that the official ceremony had denied them: recognition of their own experience. For Belgian officials, it was an act of public defiance at the exact moment when the new relationship was supposed to be established. For foreign observers, it was evidence of a leader who could not be easily controlled by diplomatic ritual.
There is an uncomfortable question here. Was Lumumba right to make that speech on Independence Day? The answer may seem obvious now, but politically he was entering a fragile coalition. Kasavubu had chosen a conciliatory tone. Belgium still had enormous influence. The new state needed administrative cooperation. Lumumba's speech maximized moral clarity but increased political risk.
That is fair as a strategic criticism. But strategic criticism is not the same as blaming him for the hostility of the people he confronted. What would the safer alternative have been? Praise the colonial system, then negotiate quietly for power that Belgium had no intention of surrendering.
The safer alternative may have been to preserve the coalition long enough to build administrative and military capacity.
A coalition built on silence is not stability. It is delayed conflict.
Maybe the sharper question is this: was Lumumba choosing between safety and danger, or between different forms of danger?
That is closer to the historical reality. The new government faced dangers whether Lumumba spoke cautiously or aggressively. The speech changed the relationship with Belgium, but it did not create the structural weaknesses of the new state.
The speech also exposed a difference between Lumumba and Kasavubu. Kasavubu represented one path into independence: formal sovereignty, diplomatic caution, cooperation with Belgium, and gradual consolidation. Lumumba represented another: national unity, popular legitimacy, anti-colonial memory, and an insistence that independence must include dignity and economic control. The two men were not simple opposites. Both opposed colonial rule. Both wanted Congolese authority. But they differed over speed, tone, institutional strategy, and the acceptable relationship with Belgium. That difference would soon become a constitutional crisis. Before it did, the new government had to confront the institution most visibly designed to preserve colonial power: the army. On July 5, only 5 days after independence, Congolese soldiers at Camp Hardy in Fisville mutinied. The Force Publique had been created and maintained as a colonial army. African soldiers served under European officers. They were denied equal status and promotion. Independence had changed the flag above them, but it had not changed the command structure beneath it. General Emile Janssens, the Belgian commander, reportedly wrote a message on a blackboard: before independence, after independence. The phrase became one of the defining symbols of the Congo crisis. Whether every detail of the story is preserved exactly as later accounts describe it, the underlying reality is documented. Congolese soldiers understood that political independence had not brought military equality. They were being asked to defend a republic while remaining subordinate to foreign officers.
The mutiny was not simply an emotional reaction to Lumumba's speech. It had material causes. The soldiers wanted promotions. They wanted African officers. They wanted pay and authority that reflected the new political order. The colonial command structure had created the crisis long before the ceremony.
And the crisis had immediate economic consequences. European civilians fled or demanded protection. Belgium sent troops back into the Congo, claiming it was protecting its citizens. That intervention gave Belgium a justification to re-enter the country militarily almost immediately after independence.
There it is. The colonial army mutinies because colonial rule refuses to end. Belgium sends troops to protect Europeans from the chaos its own system helped create. Then, the new government is treated as incompetent for failing to control the consequences.
The sequence is important, but the causal language needs care. The mutiny was driven by Congolese grievances. Belgian military intervention was a choice. The crisis cannot be reduced to one side manufacturing every event. But Belgium absolutely benefited from the breakdown.
Lumumba now faced a problem that no speech could solve. His government had inherited a state without a reliable national army. The Belgian government was sending troops back into Congolese territory. European settlers were demanding protection. The country's regions were becoming politically unstable. And the international community was about to treat the emergency as evidence that the Congolese were not ready for sovereignty. Lumumba needed force to defend the republic. He needed foreign assistance because the republic had been denied the means to defend itself. But every request for help risked changing how the outside world understood him. If he asked Belgium, he risked surrendering the independence he had just defended. If he asked the United Nations, he would discover that peacekeeping did not necessarily mean restoring the authority of the elected government. If he asked the Soviet Union, Washington would begin to see him through the vocabulary of the Cold War. The trap was closing before anyone called it a trap.
This is the moment where the story moves from ceremony to mechanics. On June 30, Lumumba challenges the narrative of a benevolent handover. On July 5, the army reveals that the handover did not include equality. The question is no longer whether independence exists on paper. The question is, who can enforce it?
The first week of the Congo's independence produced a contradiction that would define the next several months. The country was sovereign in law. It was vulnerable in practice. The colonial power had withdrawn its formal authority, but retained influence over the army, economy, administration, and international relationships. The new government had a democratic mandate, but lacked the institutional tools to make that mandate effective. And Lumumba's public language had made one thing impossible, pretending that the transition was a friendly arrangement between equals. He had named the humiliation. Now the system would show him what happened to leaders who refused to manage it quietly.
The ceremony wanted a grateful African government. Lumumba gave them an accountable one. That is why the speech still matters. Not because eloquence magically changes power. It does not. It matters because he refused to let the people who had been ruled become background decoration at their own independence.
And because he made a strategic gamble, he believed public legitimacy could compensate for institutional weakness. The coming crisis would test that belief.
It would also test whether political independence could survive without control of the minerals, the army, and the international narrative. Those were not separate problems. They were the same problem viewed from different angles.
The evidence supports a cautious conclusion. Lumumba's speech did not single-handedly cause his downfall, but it made compromise with the colonial power more difficult, made his political identity unmistakable, and signaled that he intended to connect independence with sovereignty over the state's resources. That made him more than a prime minister. It made him a possible precedent.
In the days ahead, the army will mutiny. Belgian troops will return. Katanga will secede with Belgian support. The Congo will ask the United Nations to defend its sovereignty, and the answer will expose the limits of international neutrality. The ceremony has ended. The applause has faded. The microphone has been returned. But the power struggle has only begun. A country has been declared free. Its soldiers are still commanded by foreigners. Its wealth is still tied to foreign companies. And its prime minister has just announced in front of the king that the people remember. 5 days after independence, the Congo discovers that the flag has changed faster than the country. On June 30, the Belgian colors come down. The Republic of the Congo is born. Patrice Lumumba stands before the world and declares that the people have won their freedom through struggle. On July the 5th, Congolese soldiers at Camp Hardy in Stanleyville mutiny. Their complaint is brutally simple. They are expected to defend an independent country while remaining subordinate to the same European officers who commanded them under colonial rule. The uniforms are still familiar. The hierarchy is still familiar. The insult is still familiar. The new republic has inherited a colonial army and been told to call it national.
This is the moment when the ceremony becomes a test. A nation can declare independence in a hall. It becomes independent in practice only when its institutions obey the new political order. The force publique was about to prove that the old order had not disappeared.
The mutiny was not caused by one speech, one rumor, or one impulsive act. The army had been built on racial hierarchy. Congolese soldiers served under European officers. African soldiers had limited opportunities for promotion. Senior command remained overwhelmingly white. Independence raised expectations immediately, but the structure of the army did not change with them. That contradiction was combustible.
The force publique had been the armed instrument of Belgian rule since the 19th century. It was not designed as a national army in the modern sense. Its primary function was to enforce order, protect colonial interests, suppress resistance, and secure the labor and resources on which the colony depended. African soldiers could rise to certain ranks, but the highest command positions were reserved for Europeans. The system depended on discipline without equality. That arrangement might survive as long as colonial rule remained undisguised. But after June 30, every soldier in the force publique was serving a state that claimed to be sovereign. The question was immediate. Would Congolese soldiers now receive authority equal to the independence they were being asked to defend?
The army did not suddenly become rebellious because Congolese soldiers were irrational. They looked at the new republic and asked a reasonable question. If the country belongs to us, why are we still taking orders from men who were sent here to rule us?
Reasonable questions can still produce dangerous decisions. The mutiny threatened civilians, administration, and the basic survival of the state.
Then fix the structure that created the mutiny.
That is easier to say than to do in a collapsing government with no trained officer corps ready to replace the Europeans.
And that is exactly why the colonial system was so durable. Belgium could point to the absence of Congolese officers as proof that Congolese officers were needed slowly. But the absence itself had been produced by Belgian policy. It was a dependency loop. The colony was denied the institutions required for self-government, then judged incapable because those institutions did not exist.
General Emile Janssens, the Belgian commander of the force publique, responded in a way that would become one of the most remembered gestures of the Congo crisis. He reportedly wrote on a blackboard, "Before independence, after independence." After independence, the message was intended to preserve discipline. Its effect was explosive. To the soldiers, the meaning was unmistakable. Independence had changed nothing inside the army.
We should label the chalkboard scene carefully. The broad event is documented in multiple historical accounts, but the exact wording, setting, and surviving evidence should be handled with source discipline. What is beyond dispute is the underlying policy. The Belgian command did not immediately transform the force publique into an equal Congolese national army.
And that distinction matters because the phrase has become a perfect symbol. Sometimes a symbol survives because it captures the truth of a structure, even when the details of the anecdote require verification. The question is not only whether Janssens wrote those exact words. The question is whether the institution communicated that exact message.
It did.
The mutiny spread. Congolese soldiers challenged European officers. Discipline collapsed in multiple locations. European civilians began to flee or demand protection. The new government faced the possibility that the force meant to maintain order could no longer be controlled. Lumumba and Kasai had inherited no stable security arrangement. Their government had almost no time to build one. The Belgian response was to send troops back into the Congo. Belgium presented the intervention as necessary to protect European citizens. That concern was not imaginary. Violence and disorder were spreading, and civilians were at risk. But the intervention also violated the political meaning of independence. Belgian soldiers were entering the territory of a sovereign state only days after formal withdrawal. The emergency gave Belgium a new reason to restore direct military influence.
This is where motive and consequence must be separated. Belgium could sincerely believe it was protecting civilians and still be using that emergency to preserve strategic control. Governments often act through mixed motives. Security language does not erase economic interests. The Congo was not just a country experiencing disorder. It was a country containing some of the most valuable mineral deposits on Earth.
Especially in Katanga.
Katanga was the industrial heart of the Congo. The province contained copper, cobalt, uranium, and other mineral resources. Mining companies, particularly Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, had operated there with enormous influence under Belgian colonial rule. Katanga's mines were not peripheral assets. They were central to Belgium's economic relationship with the Congo. A united national government in Leopoldville could demand control over taxation, exports, labor, and revenue. A separate Katanga, backed by Belgian personnel and protected from central authority, could preserve the existing arrangement. On July 11, Moise Tshombe declared Katanga independent. The secession was presented as a defense of Katangan autonomy and order. It was also immediately supported by Belgian military personnel, advisors, and economic interests. The provincial government did not possess the power to resist the central government alone. Belgian involvement changed the balance.
This is the first major fracture of the Republic. The army is mutinying. Belgium is returning troops. Katanga is breaking away. Lumumba is facing not one crisis, but a sequence of crises that reinforce each other.
Yes, and the timeline matters. The mutiny weakened the central government. Belgian intervention deepened the security crisis. Katanga's secession removed the country's richest province from the authority of Leopoldville. The new government was being deprived of both force and revenue at the same time.
But was Katanga's secession really a Belgian operation, or did Tshombe have an independent political base?
He had a genuine regional base and political ambitions. It would be inaccurate to portray him as a puppet with no agency. The stronger conclusion is that local and foreign interests converged. Tshombe wanted power in Katanga. Belgian officials and companies wanted protection for their influence. The secession gave both groups something they wanted.
And there was a real fear among some Katangan elites that a centralized government might redistribute wealth or punish regional opponents. The separatist argument was not invented from nothing.
No, but autonomy arguments can still function as shields for resource control. The key question is not whether Katangan elites had grievances. It is who gained control of the mines after the secession and who lost access to the revenue.
The people living above the minerals did not become wealthy because Belgium protected Katanga. The companies did.
The secession created a political geography that favored foreign intervention. Leopoldville had the legal claim to national sovereignty. Katanga had the mineral wealth. Belgium had military personnel, technical expertise, corporate relationships, and diplomatic influence. The central government had a fragile coalition and an army in revolt. The message to Lumumba was clear. The Congo could be independent in theory, while its most valuable province operated outside the national state. Lumumba demanded that Belgium withdraw. Belgium denied that it was controlling Katanga. The language became a contest between visible facts and official descriptions. European troops were present, but their presence was described as temporary protection. Mining companies influenced the region, but the arrangement was described as commercial rather than political. Katanga had separated from the central government, but the secession was described as an internal Congolese matter. The terminology blurred the chain of responsibility.
This is where evidence grading becomes essential. We can document Belgian troops in the Congo after independence. We can document Belgian support for Katanga. We can document the economic relationship between Belgium and Union Minière. But we should not claim that every Belgian official, every company executive, and every Katangan politician operated from one written plan. The evidence supports coordinated interests and material support. It does not require a single secret meeting where everyone agrees to destroy the Congo.
Sometimes, coordinated interests is the polite phrase people use when the results are too obvious to deny.
And sometimes, one plan is the dramatic phrase people use when the evidence is more complicated.
Both of you are answering different questions. Mikael is asking who benefited from the arrangement. Arias is asking what can be proven about intentional coordination. The documentary needs both answers, but it cannot use one as a substitute for the other.
Lumumba now had to decide how to defend the Republic. His government needed military assistance. Belgium was the source of the problem and could not be trusted to restore national sovereignty. The United States was watching the crisis through the emerging Cold War framework. The United Nations had been asked to intervene. On July 12, Lumumba and Kasai appealed to the United Nations for help. Their request was direct: remove Belgian forces and support the territorial integrity of the Congo. The UN responded by establishing the United Nations operation in the Congo, known as ONUC. Peacekeepers began arriving. For Lumumba, this looked like a lifeline. The Congo had requested international assistance not to surrender sovereignty, but to defend it. The central government expected the UN to help remove foreign troops and end the Katangan secession. Instead, the UN mandate would be interpreted narrowly. ONUC would help replace Belgian forces and maintain order, but it would not simply fight Lumumba's political enemies on his behalf.
The UN position was rooted in the language of neutrality and non-interference. It did not want to become a combatant in a Congolese civil conflict. But Katanga's secession was not occurring in a vacuum. Belgian soldiers and advisors were involved. The distinction between internal conflict and foreign intervention was already unstable.
And neutrality has distributional effects. If one side has foreign military support, corporate money, and control of a mineral economy, while the central government has legal authority but limited force, refusing to alter the balance does not create a neutral outcome. It preserves the existing balance.
The UN also faced a genuine danger. If peacekeepers had used force to restore Leopoldville's authority, they might have triggered a wider war and become responsible for governing the Congo directly. A peacekeeping mission cannot automatically become an army for one faction.
Calling the elected government a faction is already a political choice.
Lumumba's frustration grew. The Congo was being invaded, fragmented, and deprived of its economic center. The government had asked for help. The international response was arriving, but the help came with conditions that prevented Lumumba from using it to restore national authority. The distinction between peacekeeping and political action began to look absurd from Leopoldville. A foreign-backed secession was treated as an internal matter. A central government's attempt to end the secession could be treated as escalation. The new republic was being told to respect the boundaries of sovereignty while foreign actors operated inside those boundaries.
This is the contradiction that will drive the next chapter. The UN arrives to defend Congo's independence, but it refuses to do the one thing Lumumba believes independence requires: help the central government recover its territory.
That refusal was not necessarily a hidden order to destroy Lumumba. We should not overstate the evidence. But it had a predictable effect. It weakened the government he led and increased the pressure on him to seek assistance elsewhere.
And that elsewhere was the Soviet Union.
By August, another secession emerged in South Kasai, led by Albert Kalonji. South Kasai was rich in diamonds and strategically important. The central government now faced fragmentation in more than one direction. Katanga had separated in the south. South Kasai had broken away in the center-south. The army remained unstable. Belgian influence persisted. The UN was unwilling to use force to reunify the country. Lumumba's government was being squeezed between legal legitimacy and practical weakness. Each crisis made the next crisis easier to justify. The more territory slipped from central control, the more foreign governments could describe Lumumba as incapable of governing. The more incapable he appeared, the more international actors felt entitled to intervene. The more they intervened, the less authority his government possessed. That is how a state can be destabilized, while outsiders claim merely to be managing instability.
The economic mechanism is important. A central government depends on revenue to pay soldiers, maintain services, and negotiate with regional elites. If the mineral-producing provinces are removed from the treasury, the state loses capacity. Then the same outside observers who helped remove the revenue describe the central government as dysfunctional. It is a self-fulfilling diagnosis.
Break the state. Then blame the state for being broken.
Lumumba's opponents would later describe the crisis as the natural result of tribalism, administrative weakness, and Congolese political immaturity. Those factors existed. The Congo was deeply diverse. Its institutions were fragile. Its political parties competed aggressively. But the explanation becomes dishonest when it excludes the external forces exploiting those divisions. Belgian authorities did not invent every regional grievance. They did help shape the institutional conditions in which regional fragmentation could defeat national authority. They did support Katanga materially. They did retain military and economic influence after independence. And they did have a reason to fear a unified government led by a nationalist prime minister.
The strongest historical explanation is layered. Internal rivalries mattered. Congolese leaders made choices that intensified the crisis. Belgian officials and companies intervened to preserve interests. American officials increasingly viewed Lumumba as dangerous. The UN's limitations helped immobilize the central government. No single layer explains everything. Together, they explain the direction of events.
And this is where the anti-colonial narrative can become too comfortable. Lumumba was not only opposed by foreigners, he had Congolese rivals with legitimate political concerns. Some opposed centralization. Some feared his rhetoric. Some wanted regional autonomy. A serious account must allow Congolese agency even when foreign powers exploit it.
Congolese agency does not absolve foreign intervention.
I did not say it did.
Then the useful conclusion is this. The Congo crisis was neither a foreign puppet show nor a purely internal collapse. It was a struggle in which Congolese actors pursued their own interests inside a political and economic structure heavily shaped by Belgium and increasingly militarized by the Cold War. That is more complicated. It is also more devastating.
By the middle of August, Lumumba had reached the edge of his available options. The UN would not help him retake Katanga. Belgium was supporting the breakaway province. South Kasai had separated. The army he inherited was unreliable. The central government lacked the resources to impose its authority. He could wait for the international system to change its mind. Or he could seek help from the only major power willing to provide the transport and equipment he needed. The Soviet Union offered trucks and aircraft. Lumumba accepted. The decision was practical. Washington interpreted it as ideological. That interpretation would soon matter more than Lumumba's actual political beliefs.
This is a critical distinction. Lumumba's request for Soviet assistance does not, by itself, make him a communist or a Soviet agent. New states often seek aid from whatever power will provide it. But in the Cold War, dependence could be converted into accusation. The act of accepting a plane became evidence of allegiance.
And once the label was applied, every subsequent decision could be read through it. Request Soviet transport because the UN refused to help. Proof of communist alignment. Demand control over Congolese resources, evidence of radicalism. Oppose Belgian intervention, hostility to the West. The label simplified the situation for foreign policymakers. It did not describe Lumumba accurately.
The Congo had been independent for less than 2 months. Already, the state was being pulled apart along several lines: colonial power against national sovereignty, regional autonomy against central unity, corporate access against public control, peacekeeping against political authority, Cold War suspicion against anti-colonial nationalism. Lumumba stood at the intersection of all five. He had spoken too plainly for the ceremony. He now had to govern too weakly for the crisis. The mutiny had shown that the colonial army was not national. The Belgian intervention had shown that independence could be violated almost immediately. Katanga had shown that economic power could detach territory from the state. The UN had shown that international assistance could arrive without restoring political control, and the Soviet planes would give Washington the argument it needed.
The Congo asked the world for help defending its sovereignty. The world answered by debating whether the government asking for help was legitimate. That debate will become lethal.
In the next chapter, Washington will decide that Lumumba's nationalism is not merely inconvenient, it is dangerous. The question will not be whether he is a communist. The question will be whether a leader who controls a unified Congo might choose his own allies, his own economic policies, and his own future. And somewhere inside that fear, the word assassination will enter the official vocabulary. The country is breaking apart. Lumumba reaches for the Soviet Union because the West has refused him the tools to hold it together. The response will be to treat the request for help as proof that he must be removed. By August 1960, Patrice Lumumba's government was running out of roads, soldiers, money, and time. Katanga had seceded. South Kasai had broken away. Belgian troops remained active inside the Congo. The force publique was unstable. The United Nations had arrived, but its mandate did not give Lumumba the military assistance he wanted. He had asked the international system to defend the territorial integrity of the Congo. The international system had told him to remain patient while his country was divided. So Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union. The request was practical. The interpretation was ideological.
This is the point where the central question changes. Until now, Lumumba was a nationalist facing a collapsing state. After the Soviet request, Washington began treating him as a Cold War danger. The evidence shows that he sought transport and equipment. The harder question is why American officials transformed that request into a case for removing him.
The answer begins with context, but context is not an excuse. The Cold War had turned political uncertainty into a security emergency. Washington viewed newly independent governments through the possibility that Moscow might gain influence. In the Congo, that fear was intensified by the country's strategic minerals, its central location in Africa, and the weakness of the institutions Belgium had left behind. Lumumba's nationalism was interpreted through an American framework that had little patience for neutrality.
But did Lumumba actually claim neutrality?
He claimed Congolese sovereignty. He wanted the Congo to choose its own relationships. That is different from declaring permanent neutrality, but it was also different from accepting alignment with Washington.
And from the perspective of a superpower, independent choice can look like disloyalty when the resource at stake is too important.
The Congo was not just another new state. It sat at the center of a mineral and strategic network built during colonial rule. Copper and cobalt mattered to industry. Uranium from the Shinkolobwe mine had been used in the American atomic weapons program. The exact operational importance of Congolese uranium in 1960 should not be exaggerated into a single explanation for every American decision. But the Congo's resources were part of the strategic background. Washington did not want a hostile power gaining influence over them. Belgium did not want to lose its economic position. Congolese nationalists wanted the state to control its own wealth. Those interests collided inside a government barely 3 months old.
The strongest argument against the simple assassination narrative is that American officials had genuine strategic concerns. The Soviet Union was active in the developing world. Lumumba had accepted Soviet assistance. The Congo was unstable. A hostile regime could have threatened Western access to vital resources. That does not prove the policy was wise or lawful. It does explain why officials believed intervention was necessary.
It explains the fear. It does not establish the threat. What evidence showed that Lumumba intended to hand the Congo to Moscow?
There is no strong evidence that he was a Soviet communist agent. His political language was nationalist and Pan-Africanist. His request for Soviet transport came after the United States, and the United Nations would not provide the assistance he wanted to restore central authority.
Then, the Central Intelligence failure may have been conceptual. Washington treated a demand for independence as evidence of communist alignment.
Or Washington understood that leaders can begin as nationalists and still become useful to Moscow. Intentions can change.
That possibility is real, but it became an all-purpose justification. If a leader was nationalist, he might become communist. If he asked for Western aid, he might be unreliable. If he asked for Soviet aid, he was already dangerous. The framework could classify every outcome as proof.
The first Soviet assistance came in the form of transport, trucks, aircraft, logistical support. Lumumba needed to move troops and supplies across a country larger than Western Europe. Without transport, the central government could not respond to secession or Belgian intervention. The Soviet planes did not transform the Congo into a Soviet state. They did, however, create an image that Washington could use. A Congolese prime minister was now receiving aid from Moscow. In the language of the Cold War, that image mattered more than the circumstances that produced it.
The question is not whether the Soviets saw an opportunity. They did. The question is whether accepting their help made Lumumba responsible for the consequences of Western abandonment.
No, but it did make him vulnerable. The Soviet Union was not a neutral humanitarian actor. It wanted influence. It used anti-colonial struggles to compete with the United States and European powers. Lumumba was seeking tools to defend his government. Moscow was seeking an opening. Both statements can be true.
And the West was doing the same thing while calling its own intervention stability.
The American response hardened. President Dwight Eisenhower's administration viewed the Congo crisis as a test of Western credibility. If Lumumba remained in power with Soviet assistance, American officials feared that other African nationalist leaders might conclude that Washington could be challenged. The issue was no longer simply the Congo. It was the example the Congo might set. A successful nationalist government could demand control over its military, its mineral revenues, and its foreign policy. If it survived, other governments might try the same. Sarah Chen, that is the systems argument. States do not only react to immediate events, they react to precedents. A government with resources and a popular nationalist leader could become a model. That model could influence neighboring countries, labor movements, and anti-colonial parties. The fear was not just that Lumumba would invite Soviet advisors. The fear was that the Congo would demonstrate that formal independence could become actual sovereignty.
That is an important interpretation, but it must remain an interpretation unless documents show officials saying it directly.
Agreed. The record supports concern about Soviet influence, strategic resources, and regional instability. The broader fear precedent is a systems-level inference, not a single documented sentence.
That distinction should stay visible.
In August 1960, American officials began discussing more direct action. The Church Committee's later investigation found solid evidence of a CIA plot to assassinate Lumumba. It also found evidence that the highest levels of the American government expressed intense hostility toward him. The most disputed point concerns a National Security Council meeting on August 18th. According to the Church Committee, Eisenhower expressed strong concern about Lumumba. The committee concluded that Allen Dulles may have interpreted the president's words as authorization to eliminate him, but the committee also acknowledged ambiguity. The records did not contain a clear presidential instruction saying, "Assassinate Patrice Lumumba." Testimony from administration officials offered competing interpretations. The result is a historical problem that refuses to become simple.
The responsible wording is this. Evidence indicates that Eisenhower's hostility may have been understood by subordinates as authorization for assassination, but the surviving record does not establish an explicit written order.
And that difference is not a technicality. If we say Eisenhower ordered the assassination as settled fact, we overstate the record. If we say Eisenhower had nothing to do with it, we ignore the atmosphere and the evidence of high-level hostility.
This is where the popular narrative often fails. It wants a clean chain, president orders, agency acts, assassin fires. Covert operations rarely leave that kind of paperwork. Political responsibility can exist through signals, expectations, and delegated action even when the final command is never written.
Yes, but we still need to distinguish political responsibility from proof of a specific order.
The uncertainty is part of the story. A system designed to deny responsibility does not always produce a document that resolves responsibility.
The CIA's Congo station chief was Lawrence Raymond Devlin. Devlin had arrived in Leopoldville shortly after independence. He was an experienced intelligence officer operating in a political environment where the American embassy, Belgian officials, Congolese rivals, and United Nations personnel were all competing to shape events. According to later testimony and memoir material, Devlin was involved in efforts to remove Lumumba. He was also connected to a bizarre assassination plan involving biological poison. The plan was not a rumor invented decades later. The Church Committee documented CIA assassination planning. Sidney Gottlieb, a CIA chemist associated with covert technical operations, was sent to the Congo with a lethal substance. Popular accounts often describe the poison as being placed in toothpaste. Some details of the delivery and intended method vary across later retellings. The core fact is stronger than the most cinematic version. The CIA considered using poison to kill Lumumba and sent an agent with a lethal biological capability. The operation carried the atmosphere of a laboratory nightmare. A political leader could be removed not through a public trial or battlefield defeat, but through an object in his private life, a tube, a glass, a contaminated surface. The weapon was designed to look ordinary. The intention was not merely to kill Lumumba. It was to make the death appear disconnected from the state actors who wanted him gone.
This is why the poison plan matters, even though it was not the method that killed him. It demonstrates a willingness to treat assassination as a practical instrument of policy. It also reveals the hierarchy of concern. The legal status of Lumumba's government, the danger to civilians, and the possibility of negotiation became secondary to the question of whether he could remain politically active.
But we should not turn the poison into proof that the CIA directly executed him. The assassination plan and the later transfer to Katanga are related parts of the same crisis, but they are not identical operations.
Correct. The evidence supports a CIA plot to assassinate Lumumba. It also supports CIA involvement in efforts to undermine his government and track his movements. The evidence for direct CIA control of the firing squad is much weaker.
And that distinction may actually reveal how covert power works. An intelligence agency does not need to pull the trigger if it can create the conditions in which local or allied forces do.
That is a plausible interpretation. It becomes stronger when supported by specific records, not when treated as a universal explanation.
Devlin did not use the poison. The reasons are debated and partly known through his own later account. He regarded the plan as impractical and dangerous. Instead of carrying out the assassination directly, he became involved in efforts to weaken Lumumba's position and support alternatives to his government. That distinction matters. Refusing one method does not equal opposing the objective. A man can reject poisoned toothpaste and still work to remove the person it was intended to kill.
This is where the biography of Devlin becomes morally uncomfortable. He is not the cartoon assassin who walks into a room and fires a weapon. He is the official who assesses options, decides which are workable, and contributes to a political operation that may produce the same result through different means.
The clean hands are part of the design. Someone else is allowed to perform the visible violence. The official who arranged the conditions can later say he never pulled the trigger.
That is morally persuasive, but it still requires evidence of what Devlin knew and intended at each stage.
Then show the evidence.
There is evidence of CIA support for Mobutu and evidence that the station worked with Congolese authorities to block Lumumba's escape route. There is also later scholarship arguing that the CIA station had influence over the decision to transfer Lumumba to his enemies. The exact degree of advanced knowledge and authorization remains disputed.
By September, Lumumba's political position was deteriorating. Kasavubu dismissed him by radio. Lumumba dismissed Kasavubu in return. The constitutional crisis paralyzed the government. Colonel Joseph Mobutu stepped forward, announcing that the army would temporarily neutralize the political conflict. The language was temporary. The consequences were not. Mobutu's intervention was supported by the CIA. American officials were not simply observing a Congolese constitutional dispute. They were helping build a military alternative to Lumumba's government. The goal was not necessarily to install Mobutu immediately as a permanent dictator. The immediate goal was to prevent Lumumba from exercising power. That was enough to change the country's future.
This is a crucial distinction in covert action. You do not always need a finished regime plan. You only need to remove the actor you consider unacceptable and create a structure that serves your interests better than he did. The future can be improvised after the target is gone.
And that is why claims that Washington consciously designed every aspect of Mobutu's 32-year dictatorship should be treated cautiously. The United States supported Mobutu because he was useful against Lumumba and against perceived communist influence. Later consequences were shaped by many actors.
But once the United States supported him, it had information about his behavior and still continued to work with him. The absence of a 32-year blueprint does not erase responsibility for the first decision.
The American public was told that the Congo was falling into chaos. That description was not entirely false. There was violence, institutional collapse, and conflict across the country. But the word chaos concealed the political question. Who was making the country ungovernable? Some forces were acting independently. Some were pursuing regional power. Some were responding to local grievances. Some were receiving foreign money, arms, intelligence, or diplomatic cover. The same crisis could be described as a natural collapse or as a manipulated opportunity, depending on which actors the description included. Newton. And that is where propaganda works best, not by inventing every fact, by arranging true facts so that responsibility disappears.
The official American narrative emphasized Soviet involvement and Congolese instability. The anti-colonial narrative emphasized Belgian intervention and Western economic interests. Neither side automatically makes every claim true. The historian's task is to identify what each narrative includes and excludes.
Then let's apply the test directly. What would we need to prove that Lumumba was a Soviet proxy? A sustained political commitment to Soviet control? Secret instructions? Policy decisions consistently subordinated to Moscow? We do not have that evidence. What do we have? A request for transport after other assistance failed. That is not enough.
It is enough to create a risk, even if not enough to prove control.
Risk is not guilt.
Governments act on risk.
And governments have used alleged risk to justify crimes.
The danger of the Cold War was not only that leaders misread each other, it was that misinterpretation could become policy. Lumumba's enemies did not need to prove that he was a communist. They needed to make the possibility feel urgent. The word communist converted a struggle over sovereignty into a security emergency. It made Belgian intervention appear defensive. It made American covert action appear preventative. It made Congolese political disagreement appear part of a global contest. And it made the legal government itself look like the source of instability. The more Lumumba resisted foreign influence, the more his resistance could be described as evidence of hostile alignment. The more he sought outside help, the more vulnerable he became to the charge that he had invited foreign control. That was the mirage. He was accused of being controlled by Moscow because he refused to accept control from Brussels or Washington.
This is the resource dimension again. A sovereign Congo could negotiate with multiple powers. A Congo dependent on one external patron would be easier to influence. The fear was not only Soviet ideology, it was loss of Western exclusivity.
That is a powerful interpretation, but again, we should present it as a synthesis of strategic and economic evidence rather than a proven single motive for every official.
The distinction is uncomfortable, but necessary.
By late summer, Lumumba was still prime minister-in-law, but increasingly isolated in practice. His opponents had the president's dismissal announcement. Mobutu had the army. Katanga had Belgian support. The UN had the ability to restrict movement, but not restore his authority. Washington had covert operatives, money, and a policy of removal. Moscow had provided the transport Lumumba needed, but not a political rescue. The prime minister was being pushed toward the position his enemies had already assigned him, a dangerous man whose survival would prolong the crisis. The fact that the crisis had been intensified by foreign intervention disappeared from the explanation. The problem became Lumumba himself.
By now, the central question is no longer, was Lumumba a communist? It is, what did foreign governments need the world to believe about him before they could justify removing him?
They needed him to be more than a nationalist. They needed him to be a security threat.
And the evidence does not support that transformation as a neutral description. It was a political construction.
Or a risk assessment shaped by the realities of the Cold War.
Those are not mutually exclusive. A risk assessment can be politically constructed.
The assassination plan had failed to produce a dead Lumumba. The poison remained unused, but the political operation was working. Lumumba was isolated from effective state power. His government was divided. His military position was broken. His international protection was uncertain. The next step would not require a laboratory. It would require paperwork, soldiers, and a legal crisis. A president would dismiss him. He would dismiss the president. Parliament would be pulled into the dispute. And a young colonel, supported by the CIA, would announce that politics had become too dangerous for politicians. The coup would present itself as a pause. In reality, it would turn a constitutional crisis into a military trap. The United States had not yet publicly declared war on Lumumba. It did something more effective. It began treating his removal as an administrative necessity. On September 5, 1960, the crisis in the Congo moves from the battlefield to the radio. Joseph Kasavubu, the president of the republic, announces that he has dismissed Patrice Lumumba as prime minister. The announcement is broadcast across the country. It is presented as a constitutional decision. Lumumba does not accept it. Hours later, he responds by dismissing Kasavubu. The president says the prime minister is gone. The prime minister says the president is gone. The country is left with two competing claims to authority and no functioning mechanism strong enough to settle the dispute.
This is the moment when a legal argument becomes a weapon. Both men are speaking in the language of constitutional government. But outside the radio studios, power is being measured by soldiers, foreign advisors, money, and control of communication.
The constitutional question was genuinely complicated. The young republic's institutions were new. The division of authority between president and prime minister was not fully settled in practice, and the crisis had already damaged the government's ability to function. But legal ambiguity did not exist in isolation. It was being used by political actors with very different resources.
And that is the first test. Are we describing a constitutional crisis, or are we using the Constitution to disguise a coup?
Both descriptions capture part of what happened. The dispute began as a constitutional confrontation. It became a coup because the military intervened and foreign governments supported the forces that prevented Lumumba from exercising power.
Kasavubu's dismissal of Lumumba was not simply a personal quarrel. The two men represented different strategies for navigating a collapsing state. Kasavubu favored a more cautious relationship with Belgium and a political arrangement that gave the presidency greater authority. Lumumba defended the legitimacy of the parliamentary majority that had brought him to the premiership and argued that Kasavubu had no right to remove him unilaterally. The disagreement was intensified by the crisis in Katanga, the mutiny in the army, and the growing international pressure on the government. Kasavubu could present Lumumba as reckless and destabilizing. Lumumba could present Kasavubu as surrendering the republic to foreign influence. Both men had supporters. Neither had an uncontested path to victory.
But only one of them was being treated as the emergency. The country was invaded. A province had seceded with foreign support. The army had been built on colonial racism. Yet the prime minister who objected to those conditions was described as the source of the crisis.
Because institutions tend to define disorder according to who threatens their arrangements. Lumumba was not the only cause of instability. He was the actor most likely to change the underlying distribution of power. That made him the most urgent problem for the people who benefited from the existing structure.
Or it made him the most dangerous because he was willing to take extraordinary measures during a national emergency. His request for Soviet assistance, his confrontation with Kasavubu, and his pressure on the UN all suggested a leader who might bypass institutions when they frustrated him.
That argument needs a standard. What did Lumumba bypass exactly? The parliament had supported him. The UN had refused to help restore the territory. The president had dismissed him through a radio announcement while the constitutional issue was unresolved. Calling him authoritarian because he resisted an untested dismissal is not proof. It is interpretation.
The parliament became central to the dispute. Lumumba's supporters argued that the legislature had to decide whether the government remained in office. Kasavubu's supporters argued that the president had constitutional authority to dismiss the prime minister. The crisis might have been settled through debate, negotiation, or a vote. But the political system was operating under pressure from armed forces and foreign intervention. A parliament cannot easily defend its authority when soldiers control roads, airports, and radio stations. The argument about legality continued. The ability to enforce legality was disappearing.
This is the distinction that will follow Lumumba through the rest of the story. He may still be prime minister-in-law, but can he command the state in practice?
By September, the answer was increasingly no. Katanga was outside his control. The Central Army was unreliable. Belgian troops remained involved. The UN controlled access to strategic spaces. Kosavubu had claimed to dismiss him. Lumumba still had parliamentary support and popular legitimacy, but legitimacy without enforcement had become vulnerable.
Then, Colonel Joseph Désiré Mobutu entered the center of the crisis. Mobutu was 29 years old, a former journalist and army officer who had worked near Lumumba during the early months of independence. On September 14, he announced that the military was neutralizing the politicians. The phrasing mattered. Mobutu did not present himself as a dictator seizing power. He presented himself as a temporary referee. The politicians, he implied, had failed. The army would pause the conflict and allow the country to recover. The operation became known as a coup, but its public language was administrative. No revolution, no permanent military government. Just a temporary suspension until the politicians could be trusted again.
That is how many coups protect themselves from immediate resistance. They describe power as maintenance. The army is not ruling, it is stabilizing. The government is not overthrown, it is temporarily neutralized. The constitution is not abolished, it is being protected from politicians. The language turns seizure into service.
And temporary is the favorite word of people who want permanent power.
Sometimes temporary intervention really is temporary. The claim should not be dismissed merely because later events proved Mobutu's rule was long and brutal.
True, but intent cannot be judged only by the label used in the announcement. We need to ask who benefited immediately, who funded the operation, and which political actor was prevented from returning to office.
The immediate beneficiary was not the constitutional process. It was the coalition determined to prevent Lumumba from exercising authority.
The United States supported Mobutu. The CIA provided money and political assistance to the military leadership. American officials viewed Mobutu as a way to block Lumumba without openly installing a colonial government or launching a direct American intervention. That distinction allowed Washington to maintain a public posture of concern for constitutional order while privately backing the officer who had suspended ordinary political authority. The operation did not need to resolve the Congo's crisis. It only needed to prevent Lumumba from resolving it on his own terms.
This is the anatomy of the coup. The legal dispute creates uncertainty. The military claims neutrality. Foreign intelligence supplies support. The elected government loses the ability to act. And then, the paralysis is used as proof that the government had to be removed.
That sequence is supported by the documentary record, although individual decisions and chains of command remain subjects of historical debate. The CIA's support for Mobutu is not merely a later accusation. American records show that Washington viewed him as useful and provided covert assistance.
But CIA-backed coup should not become shorthand, for Mobutu had no independent political agency. He did. He made choices, built relationships, and understood how to use the crisis. The fact that Washington supported him does not mean Washington controlled every decision he made.
Agency and dependency can exist together. Mobutu was not a puppet in the sense of having no choices. He was a local actor whose choices were strengthened by foreign sponsorship. That is more accurate and more revealing.
Lumumba's position became increasingly precarious. He was still formally prime minister in the eyes of his supporters and much of parliament. But the state's coercive instruments were now controlled by men who had decided that he could not be allowed to use them. The military blocked access to government offices. The radio became a contested instrument. Political meetings were restricted. Lumumba's supporters were watched, arrested, or intimidated. The Prime Minister's house became a political enclosure. The United Nations stationed troops nearby. From a distance, this could look like protection. In practice, it was a peculiar form of custody. UN soldiers could prevent some forces from entering the residence. They did not restore Lumumba's authority. They did not escort him back to the government buildings. They did not remove Mobutu's troops from the capital. They guarded a man whose government they would not help reconstitute.
Protection that leaves the prisoner surrounded is not freedom. The UN would later argue that it was trying to prevent civil war and remain neutral. But neutral between whom? A prime minister with parliamentary support and an army-backed force that had suspended politics?
The UN faced legal and operational limits. Its mandate did not automatically authorize it to impose Lumumba's preferred political settlement. But neutrality had consequences. By refusing to help Lumumba reclaim state authority, the UN left him isolated inside a security perimeter controlled by his opponents.
And we need to distinguish two claims. The claim that the UN directly planned Lumumba's death is not established. The claim that its policy contributed to his isolation is much stronger. One is a conspiracy claim, the other is an institutional consequence.
The political crisis now moved through multiple capitals. In Brussels, Belgian officials debated how to protect their interests and prevent Lumumba from returning to power. In Washington, officials treated the Congo as a Cold War emergency. In New York, the UN struggled to define what neutrality meant while its peacekeepers became part of the country's political geography. In Leopoldville, Congolese leaders fought over the meaning of sovereignty. The decisions were separated by thousands of miles. Their effects converged on one residence. Lumumba was no longer only a prime minister under attack. He was a political problem being processed by institutions that could deny responsibility because each claimed to be dealing with a different aspect of the crisis. Belgium said it was protecting its citizens and interests. Washington said it was preventing communist expansion. The UN said it was maintaining peace. Mobutu said he was neutralizing politicians. Each explanation contained part of the truth. Together, they produced a cage.
That is what makes the episode structurally important. No single institution needs to announce, "We are imprisoning Lumumba." Each one performs a narrower task. One limits movement, another supplies money, another controls the army, another builds the legal argument, another denies that the outcome was intended. The result can be coordinated without looking coordinated.
That is a useful analytical model, but we should not confuse an emergent system with a proven command structure. The historical record shows overlapping actions and interests. It does not give us a complete transcript of every agreement between every actor.
Which is why the documentary must show the gaps instead of filling them with certainty. The gaps are where denial lives.
By late September, Lumumba tried to assert that he remained the legitimate prime minister. He appealed to parliament. He spoke publicly. He rejected the authority of Mobutu's intervention. But the political space available to him was shrinking. His movements were restricted. His supporters were under pressure. The UN's presence made it harder for Mobutu's forces to arrest him immediately, but it did not give Lumumba a path back to effective government. This was not a conventional prison. There were no formal charges. There was no completed trial. There was no clear sentence. There was simply a perimeter, soldiers, surveillance, and the knowledge that leaving the residence could mean arrest.
This is the point where the phrase house arrest becomes misleading. It suggests a legal order. What Lumumba faced was de facto confinement imposed by armed forces while international personnel stood nearby.
Yes, though we should be careful with the exact legal characterization, the situation developed through overlapping military and political controls rather than one transparent judicial process.
Which is precisely why it was so effective. A formal prisoner can claim rights. A politically isolated leader can be told that nothing has happened to him.
During this period, Belgian officials continued to work on the diplomatic and administrative side of Lumumba's removal. The evidence from the later Belgian parliamentary inquiry points to involvement by members of the Belgian government and other Belgian figures in the circumstances that led to his death. It does not establish that a single Belgian minister issued a surviving written command to the firing squad. That distinction must remain visible. But the inquiry documented a chain of hostility, intervention, planning, and transfer that made Lumumba vulnerable to his enemies. One figure who would later become central to this history was Étienne Davignon, then a young Belgian diplomat. The evidence surrounding his role concerns political and administrative action leading to Lumumba's detention and transfer, not a proven handwritten order saying, "Execute him." In 2026, decades later, Belgian prosecutors would accuse Davignon of involvement in Lumumba's unlawful detention and degrading treatment. A court would order him to stand trial. He would die before the proceedings could begin. That later legal history belongs to the epilogue. But the early documents already show the logic taking shape. Remove Lumumba from politics. Prevent his return. Place him where his enemies can control him. Do not ask what happens next in a way that creates legal responsibility.
The sentence does not have to say, "Kill him," if everyone in the chain understands what delivery means.
That may be morally obvious, but legally it still requires evidence about knowledge and intent.
And the strongest evidence emerges when the transfer is examined alongside earlier instructions and later conduct. The sequence matters.
Lumumba's opponents did not all agree on what should happen to him. Some wanted him imprisoned. Some wanted him exiled. Some wanted him tried. Some feared that any public trial would turn him into an even greater symbol. Some wanted him removed permanently. The ambiguity was dangerous because it allowed different actors to support the same operation for different reasons. Washington could see Lumumba's political disappearance as a security solution. Belgian officials could see it as protection for their interests. Mobutu could see it as the elimination of a rival. Katangan leaders could see it as a chance to destroy the man who threatened their secession. The UN could see the situation as a domestic political dispute outside its mandate. A single decision could therefore move forward without a single shared explanation.
This is the difference between an assassination plot and a political ecosystem that makes assassination possible. The poison plan was a discrete plot. The later transfer was a chain. The chain involved different motives, different institutions, and different levels of knowledge. But each step reduced Lumumba's chance of survival.
That framing is persuasive, but it risks making outcome equal intent. A transfer can be reckless, unlawful, and disastrous without everyone involved wanting murder.
Yes, which is why they wanted the outcome must be argued, actor by actor. But we also cannot treat catastrophic recklessness as politically meaningless. If you deliver a hated prisoner to armed enemies without safeguards, you are responsible for creating the danger, whether or not you say the word murder.
That is the question the final chapters will need to answer. Not only who wanted Lumumba dead, who knew enough to understand that their decision placed him in mortal danger and proceeded anyway.
The crisis entered a quieter phase. No gunfire was required. Lumumba remained alive but politically contained. His presence still mattered. As long as he was free to speak, organize, and appeal to Parliament, the possibility of restoring his government remained. His enemies therefore had to maintain the appearance of normality while preventing normal politics from returning. The state continued to exist on paper. The Prime Minister continued to exist on paper. The Constitution continued to exist on paper. But the country was being governed through force and foreign pressure. This was the coup in its most efficient form, not the dramatic seizure of every building, the slow removal of a government's ability to act.
If this investigation matters to you, follow the channel. We are tracing not only the final act, but the decisions that made the final act possible.
By October, Belgian officials were using increasingly direct language about Lumumba's removal. One cable associated with Belgian Foreign Minister Harold Aspremont-Linden referred to the need for his definitive elimination. The phrase has become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the story. It must also be read carefully. Definitive elimination can mean political elimination, physical elimination, or an intentionally ambiguous combination of both. The context suggests that Belgian officials wanted Lumumba removed from the political landscape permanently. The cable does not, by itself, prove a direct order to a firing squad. But it destroys the idea that Belgian policy was limited to neutral observation. Belgian officials were discussing the removal of Lumumba as a problem requiring a final solution.
This is a high-confidence document with a low ambiguity political meaning, but a higher ambiguity legal meaning. The phrase shows intent to eliminate Lumumba as a political force. It does not independently establish who ordered the physical execution months later.
And that is exactly how it should be presented. The strongest evidence does not need exaggeration. It is damning because it shows that the goal was not reconciliation or neutral mediation.
They wanted the man gone. The argument is about how much violence they were willing to let others use.
Lumumba understood that his confinement was becoming permanent. The UN perimeter around his residence was no longer a shield that could restore his authority. It was a warning. Outside the compound were soldiers loyal to Mobutu and hostile to Lumumba. Inside were advisors, family members, and supporters watching the political world narrow. He had lost control of the capital. He had lost access to the state apparatus. He had lost the protection he expected from the international organization he had invited. But he still had supporters in Stanleyville. Antoine Gizenga and other Lumumbist forces were regrouping there. If Lumumba could reach Stanleyville, he might join them and establish a rival government. That plan was dangerous. It was also his last remaining political route. The compound was no longer a place from which he could govern. It was a place from which he had to escape.
The escape should not be described as a reckless impulse without context. Lumumba was facing political extinction. Remaining in the residence meant waiting for his opponents to decide how to handle him. Leaving created the possibility of reaching loyalist territory.
It also created the risk that he would be captured and killed.
Which is why the next decision is not simply a military maneuver. It is a choice between passive confinement and active danger.
At the end of November, Lumumba would make that choice. He would leave the residence at night. He would attempt to cross hundreds of miles towards Stanleyville. The CIA station would work with Congolese authorities to block possible escape routes. The road would become mud, distance, and pursuit. And on the banks of the Sankuru River, the political crisis would become personal. Before the final transfer. Before Katanga. Before the firing squad. A husband would be forced to choose between his own freedom and the safety of his family. The coup had not killed Lumumba. It had done something more useful. It had made him vulnerable, isolated, and desperate enough to run. On the night of November 27, 1960, Patrice Lumumba leaves his residence. For weeks, the house has been surrounded. The United Nations is nearby. Mobutu's soldiers control the roads. Lumumba is still prime minister in the eyes of his supporters, but he cannot reach the ministries, command the army, or move through the capital without risking arrest. Staying means waiting. Leaving means pursuit. He chooses pursuit. He chooses pursuit. The plan is to reach Stanleyville, where Antoine Gizenga and Lumumba's supporters are gathering. If Lumumba can cross the country, join the loyalist forces, and establish a rival government, the coup may still be reversed. The distance is roughly 600 miles. The roads are poor. The rainy season is beginning. The army is watching. The escape begins in darkness, with Lumumba trying to leave not as a head of government, but as a hunted man.
This is often told as an adventure story. The prime minister slips through the perimeter and races across the Congo. But the deeper story is about the loss of ordinary political options. Lumumba is not escaping because politics has failed in the abstract. He is escaping because politics has been surrounded by soldiers.
The broad sequence is documented. Lumumba left his residence, traveled toward Stanleyville, and was captured on December 1st near the Sankuru River. The exact details of the journey are less certain. Later accounts differ over routes, vehicles, companions, and the precise circumstances at the river. That uncertainty should not erase the event. It should tell us where the reconstruction begins.
Lumumba reportedly traveled in a Chevrolet convoy. The vehicle moved through rain-soaked roads and rural settlements, carrying the former prime minister and a small group of companions. The convoy could not move like an ordinary political delegation. Every road might contain a checkpoint. Every town might contain soldiers loyal to Mobutu. Every delay increased the chance of detection. The journey was not only a flight from Leopoldville. It was a race toward a different Congo. In Stanleyville, Lumumba's supporters were building a rival center of power. The city would become the heart of a Lumumbist administration led by Gizenga after Lumumba's capture. If Lumumba reached it, the political crisis would not end. It would become a struggle between competing governments.
That possibility explains the urgency of the pursuit. Lumumba's enemies did not merely want to know where he was. They needed to prevent him from reaching a territory where his political legitimacy, popular support, and international profile could combine with armed resistance. A fugitive prime minister in a car was dangerous. A fugitive prime minister who reached a loyalist capital was far more dangerous.
The CIA station in Leopoldville sent a cable on November 28 indicating that it was working with Congolese authorities to block roads and alert troops along possible escape routes. That is an important document because it shows active efforts to obstruct Lumumba's escape.
It also changes the language. He was not simply caught by a superior military operation. His route was being anticipated, blocked, and communicated. The question becomes, how much of the dragnet was improvised and how much was coordinated through intelligence?
The cable proves coordination around escape routes. It does not give us a complete map of every unit involved or prove that every checkpoint knew Lumumba was coming.
Fair. But it destroys the idea that the capture was random.
The road west of Leopoldville gave way to mud. Rain altered the landscape. Vehicles became slower, heavier, louder. A modern audience may imagine escape as movement through open space. But in a country with limited roads, movement creates a trail. A car requires fuel. A convoy requires supplies. A major political figure cannot travel invisibly for long. Lumumba was attempting to cross a vast country through infrastructure built for colonial extraction, not national mobility. The roads connected mines, administrative centers, and ports. They did not create a seamless national system. That weakness now worked against him. A government that could not move its own people, supplies, and messages efficiently could not easily move a fugitive leader beyond the reach of its enemies.
The same colonial geography that carried wealth out of the Congo now helped trap the man trying to reunify it. The roads were built to connect resources to export routes, not citizens to one another.
Lumumba's companions knew the danger. Some accounts describe advice that he should turn back, take another route, or avoid exposing his family. The details of private conversations cannot be established with certainty, but the larger dilemma is clear. Lumumba was not traveling alone. Pauline Opango Lumumba, his wife, was connected to the journey and to the danger surrounding it. Their children were also vulnerable. The escape was therefore not a simple calculation between political victory and political defeat. Every movement carried consequences for people who had not chosen to become targets.
This is where the personal story enters the machinery. Until now, the crisis has been described through governments, armies, cables, and mandates. At the river, the question becomes painfully ordinary. How far can one person run when his family is being used as leverage?
We need to be careful here. The popular account says Pauline and the infant Roland were captured on the opposite bank and that Lumumba returned after hearing their screams. That is a powerful story, but the exact details are not equally secure in every source. What is well established is that Lumumba was captured near the Sankuru River and that family members were caught up in the violence and danger surrounding his escape. The specific sequence of his crossing and return should be presented as contested or reconstructed, not as an unquestionable transcript.
Good, because the emotional power of the scene can tempt a writer to overstate the evidence. A story can be morally true without every cinematic detail being documented.
And uncertainty should not become an excuse to drain the scene of its human reality.
By the end of November, Lumumba's convoy had reached the area of the Sankuru River. The river was not a symbolic boundary at the time, it was an obstacle. The crossing depended on local transport, weather, and the ability to move people and vehicles without attracting attention. On one bank, soldiers were searching. On the other, escape remained possible. The river offered a temporary opening in the dragnet. It also created a trap. If Lumumba crossed without his family or companions, he might reach safety while leaving them behind. If he waited, the soldiers might close the distance. If he turned back, he might be captured. The escape had narrowed to a decision measured in seconds.
This is what coercion looks like when it is not announced. Mobutu's forces did not need to issue a public order saying, use Lumumba's family to force his surrender. The threat could operate through proximity. If his family was in danger, the decision was no longer free. The state had turned personal attachment into a security instrument.
That interpretation assumes the family was intentionally used as leverage. Do we have proof that the soldiers planned it that way?
We may not have proof of a written plan, but coercive systems often use opportunities they did not create in advance. The question is not only what they planned, it is what they understood and exploited once it happened.
And whether the later narrative about the surrender was shaped to portray Lumumba as a heroic father rather than a leader defeated by an intelligence operation.
Why are those mutually exclusive? He could be strategically outmaneuvered and still choose his family.
At some point during the crossing, Lumumba's escape appears to have succeeded, at least briefly. He reached the far side, or came close enough to believe that freedom was possible. Then the situation changed. Accounts describe the capture of Pauline and the children, or the threat of their capture, on the opposite bank. The image has become central to Lumumba's legend. The Prime Minister has crossed to safety, hears his family in danger, and turns back. The evidence does not allow every detail to be fixed with confidence. But the story persists because it expresses a recognizable truth about the political terror of the moment. Lumumba was not only a symbol. He was a husband and father forced to make a choice inside an armed operation.
Let's phrase the claim carefully. We cannot prove every word spoken at the river, but we can say that Lumumba's capture occurred in a situation where his family's safety was part of the pressure surrounding him. And it is plausible, though not conclusively established, that concern for Pauline and the children influenced his decision.
That is the evidence-graded version.
And it is stronger than pretending certainty where the archive is thin.
Lumumba returned toward the river. The soldiers took him. The precise physical details of the capture vary in the record, but the result is not disputed. The escape had ended. The man who had crossed the country trying to reach loyalist forces was now in the hands of the army that had overthrown him. The capture was not the result of a formal arrest warrant executed through a transparent judicial process. It was an armed seizure of a political leader whose government had been suspended by force.
The language matters. He was not apprehended in some neutral administrative sense. He was hunted, cornered, and captured. The government that claimed to be restoring order had turned a prime minister into prey.
And yet the Congolese soldiers who captured him were also operating inside a civil conflict, where they believed he threatened the country.
Belief does not make the capture legal.
No, but it explains why local actors participated.
Both points belong in the account. Lumumba's capture involved Congolese forces and local political conflict. It also occurred within a larger environment shaped by foreign intelligence and Belgian intervention. The local actors were not imaginary. The foreign influence was not imaginary either.
The United Nations was present in the region. This has generated one of the most enduring accusations in the Lumumba story, that UN troops stood by while he was captured. The broad criticism is supported by the outcome. The UN did not prevent Lumumba's arrest or secure his release. But the exact local decisions require precision. UN personnel operated under mandates, rules, and interpretations that limited direct intervention in Congolese political disputes. Their commanders feared becoming participants in a civil war. They were not authorized to act as Lumumba's personal army. That institutional explanation does not erase the moral consequence. Lumumba had invited international assistance to defend Congolese sovereignty. When he was captured, the organization did not use its presence to protect him from the forces pursuing him.
The strongest claim is not that every UN soldier consciously decided to facilitate his murder. The stronger claim is that the UN's policy allowed his capture and did not treat his political status as requiring rescue.
Yes. The record shows a failure of protection, not necessarily a single order saying, let Lumumba be taken.
But policy is made of those failures. An institution can be complicit through the limits it chooses to enforce.
Lumumba was bound and placed under guard. His journey had taken him from the official residence of a prime minister to a vehicle controlled by the army of a military regime. The distance between those two locations measured more than the roads across the Congo. It measured the destruction of constitutional authority. The government had not fallen through one clean moment. It had been weakened through dismissal, counter-dismissal, military neutralization, foreign support, territorial secession, and international restraint. Now the man who had spoken for the government was physically separated from the institutions that had once recognized him. The coup had completed its first objective. Lumumba was no longer in a position to act. The next objective was to decide what to do with him. On December the 7th, Lumumba was flown back toward Leopoldville. The images of his arrival would become some of the most disturbing visual evidence of the crisis. He appeared beaten, bound, and stripped of the public dignity associated with his office. Photographers captured the spectacle. The world could see a prime minister in captivity. What the world could not see was a functioning system prepared to stop the abuse.
The cameras did not protect him. They documented the absence of protection. And once the arrest was public, the political question became harder to evade. What does the international community do when the elected head of government is beaten in front of reporters? Does it intervene? Does it condemn? Does it say the matter is internal? Does it wait for someone else to decide?
In practice, the response was fragmented and weak. The United States and Belgium had reasons to prefer Lumumba out of power. The UN was constrained by its interpretation of neutrality. Congolese authorities controlled the prisoner. The result was that visibility did not produce accountability.
The journey from the river to the capital was not a rescue. It was a transfer into deeper confinement. Lumumba would be imprisoned at Thisville, also known as Camp Hardy. His captors could now present the operation as a successful restoration of order. The former prime minister had been captured by Congolese soldiers. Foreign governments could emphasize the internal nature of the arrest. The UN could say that it had not authorized the military to kill him. Belgium could deny direct responsibility. The Soviet Union could protest. The world could watch the images and still avoid the question of who had created the conditions for the capture. This is how political responsibility becomes difficult to prosecute. Every actor points to the next link. The Congolese soldiers made the arrest. Mobutu's regime controlled the prison. Belgian officials influenced the political environment. The CIA supported the coup and tracked the escape. The UN failed to protect him. No single actor needs to claim the entire chain. At the river, Lumumba had lost his freedom, but he had not yet lost his political meaning. His supporters in Stanleyville still claimed him. His name continued to mobilize people. His imprisonment could transform him from a contested prime minister into a martyr. That possibility frightened his enemies. A living Lumumba could be used in negotiations. A living Lumumba could address the country. A living Lumumba could become the center of an opposition government. A dead Lumumba could become something more dangerous, a symbol beyond control. The people who captured him needed to decide whether detention was enough.
This is why the prison mutiny later becomes so important. As long as Lumumba is alive, every guard, soldier, and political faction creates uncertainty. The question is no longer only whether he can escape, it is whether someone else might release him.
And whether international actors will accept responsibility if he is harmed.
They had already accepted the danger. They simply had not accepted the consequences.
Pauline's story does not end at the river. The family would face flight, intimidation, and exile. The children would grow up with the knowledge that their father's political enemies had made the family part of the battlefield. Later accounts would turn Pauline into a symbol of the personal cost of the Congo crisis. But before she became the figure demanding her husband's remains, she was a young woman living through the collapse of a government and the capture of her family. That human scale matters. The Congo crisis was not only a contest between institutions, it was a series of decisions that entered homes, vehicles, prison cells, and family relationships. Lumumba's political choices were made under pressure. Pauline's life was reshaped by decisions she did not control.
The archive often preserves cables better than fear. We have records of routes, dates, orders, and meetings. We have fewer reliable records of what people felt in the moment. That is where reconstruction must be clearly marked. But the absence of a document does not mean the human consequences were absent.
The capture at the Sankuru River resolves one question. Lumumba was not stopped by an invisible wall around the country. He escaped the initial dragnet. He traveled deep into the Congo. He came close to reaching loyalist territory. His capture resulted from a combination of surveillance, roadblocks, military pursuit, local information, terrain, and the vulnerabilities created by traveling with family and companions. But the capture creates a more frightening question. What happens to a leader whose enemies have already discussed his permanent removal, who is now held by a regime dependent on foreign support, and whose international protectors refuse to treat his custody as their responsibility? The answer begins at Njili Airport. There, the former prime minister will be displayed as a defeated man. His glasses will be gone. His hands will be bound. Cameras will record the humiliation, and the world will see what happens when sovereignty becomes a spectacle. Lumumba crossed the river looking for a government. He returned because freedom was no longer only his to save. Now he was being carried back toward the capital, where the people who feared his voice would try to destroy his legitimacy in public. On December 7, 1960, Patrice Lumumba returns to Leopoldville as a prisoner. The man who had stood beside King Baudouin at the independence ceremony is no longer presented as prime minister. He is brought back in restraints. His hands are tied behind him. His clothing is disordered. His face is swollen. His glasses are gone. The cameras are waiting. The scene is not hidden in a remote prison. It unfolds at an airport, in front of reporters and photographers, where the former head of government is displayed as proof that the coup has succeeded. The message is meant for more than Lumumba. It is meant for everyone watching. The prime minister can be beaten. The parliament can be bypassed. The international community can observe, and nobody will restore him.
A political arrest removes a person from power. A public humiliation tries to remove the person from legitimacy. The goal is not simply to keep Lumumba in custody. It is to make the audience see him as already defeated.
The photographs and press coverage established the broad reality of the scene. Lumumba was captured, beaten, bound, and publicly displayed after his return to Leopoldville. Some of the most vivid details in later retellings require more caution, especially the claim that soldiers forced him to eat the transcript of his independence speech. That detail may have circulated through eyewitness accounts and press reports, but it should not be presented as settled fact without a verified primary source for the exact incident.
And that caution is not a retreat from the brutality. The documented violence is already enough. We do not need to turn a disputed detail into the centerpiece just because it is visually shocking.
The image of Lumumba being dragged from a truck has survived because it compresses the entire Congo crisis into one frame. A democratic leader is treated as a criminal. A former colonial power has helped produce the military situation around him. A foreign intelligence service has supported the coup that removed him. A United Nations force is present in the country. And still, the prisoner is beaten in front of cameras. The image does not tell us every fact. It does tell us what the captors wanted the world to see.
They wanted to erase the office before they could erase the man. If people saw a prime minister, they might ask who had the authority to arrest him. If they saw a defeated prisoner, they might assume the authority question was already settled.
Or the soldiers were acting out of rage, revenge, and indiscipline. Not every public act of violence is a carefully designed propaganda operation.
Spontaneous violence still communicates power.
Yes, but intention matters.
The strongest position is that the humiliation had both elements. Individual soldiers may have acted impulsively or cruelly, while the broader spectacle served the political interests of the regime.
Mobutu's government needed to turn the capture into a completed political fact. Lumumba was still legally significant. He had won legislative support. He had served as prime minister. His supporters still considered him the legitimate head of government. His removal had not erased those facts. The coup had suspended the political process, but it had not persuaded everyone that the suspension was lawful. Humiliation offered a shortcut. Instead of answering the constitutional argument, the regime could display the man who made it. Instead of debating parliament, it could let the images speak. Instead of proving that Mobutu's intervention was legitimate, it could make Lumumba look too degraded to return.
That is what makes humiliation politically efficient. It does not have to persuade everyone that the victim is guilty. It only has to make the victim's restoration feel impossible. People begin to ask whether a government can return after its leader has been publicly beaten, whether a prisoner can still command loyalty, whether resistance is worth the cost. The spectacle converts fear into political calculation.
And for the international audience, it creates another effect. It makes the crisis look internal. Congolese soldiers beat a Congolese politician. Foreign governments can say the violence belongs to the Congo. The history of intervention disappears behind the image of local disorder.
The United Nations was not far away. Its mission had been invited to help defend Congolese sovereignty and replace Belgian forces. But ONU's interpretation of neutrality meant it would not restore Lumumba's government by force. It would not escort him back to office. It would not treat the military coup as a problem that required reversing. It would not make his political legitimacy the center of its mission. This was not the same as planning his death. The available evidence does not support that sweeping claim, but it created a condition in which Lumumba's enemies could act with growing confidence. The organization that might have imposed a limit on the coup instead focused on preventing a wider conflict. The government was suspended. The prime minister was isolated. The UN maintained a perimeter. The political facts were frozen.
The phrase, "the UN stood by," can become too broad. Which UN unit? Which commander? What order? What information was available at that moment? We need those details if we are making a factual accusation.
Agreed, but the institutional conclusion is clear. ONUT did not protect Lumumba's political authority, did not prevent his capture, and did not secure his release after the public abuse.
That is the claim we can prove.
And it is damning enough.
Lumumba was taken to Camp Hardy in Thisville, a military prison south of Leopoldville. The prison was not a neutral holding facility. It was controlled by soldiers whose loyalty to Mobutu's new order was uncertain and whose relationship to Lumumba was shaped by the same colonial military hierarchy that had produced the July mutiny. Lumumba's arrival created a new problem. The regime had captured him, but it had not made him disappear. Inside the prison, he remained politically dangerous. Guards could hear his speeches. Soldiers could see that he was not a foreign invader or a secret Soviet commander. He was a Congolese politician who had been prime minister weeks earlier. The more visibly he was abused, the more the prison became a place where the legitimacy of the regime could be questioned.
This is one reason the prison mutiny matters. The danger was not only that Lumumba might physically escape. The danger was that the men guarding him might decide that the new order was illegitimate.
The story of the eaten words has become a symbol of that humiliation. According to later accounts, soldiers forced Lumumba to chew or swallow a paper containing his independent speech. The image is almost too perfect. The man who had denounced colonial rule is forced to consume his own words. His speech, once projected as a declaration of national dignity, becomes an object of degradation. But the evidence is uneven. The documentary can use the image as a reported account, not as an unquestioned fact. Where the exact act cannot be independently verified, the narration must say so. What is documented is more than enough. Lumumba was beaten, stripped of the visual signs of office, bound, and publicly humiliated. The political meaning remains whether or not the paper entered his mouth.
This is a good example of why skepticism protects the story. If the disputed detail is wrong, opponents can use it to dismiss the documented abuse. The evidence does not need embellishment.
But neither should we hide behind the disputed detail to avoid saying what happened. The violence was public. The cameras were present. The world saw a prime minister treated as a thing.
The images traveled. They entered newspapers, archives, and political memory. For Lumumba's supporters, they confirmed that the new government was not a neutral caretaker administration. For his enemies, they demonstrated that the man who had challenged them could be reduced to helplessness. For foreign governments, they became evidence of the Congo's instability while concealing the role those governments had played in creating the conditions. This is how images can work in opposite directions. They expose violence. They also become part of the narrative that justifies further control. A photograph of chaos can be used to demand intervention. A photograph of a beaten politician can be used to say that local actors are responsible. A record of abuse can be preserved while accountability is avoided.
The international audience often wants a clean distinction between the civilized observer and the violent local scene. But the observer may have shaped the scene through earlier decisions. When foreign governments support a coup, restrict the central government, or tolerate a secession, they cannot later treat the resulting violence as evidence that the country was naturally incapable of self-rule.
That is a strong causal argument, but again, the chain is layered. Belgian intervention, Congolese rivalries, Mobutu's decisions, CIA support, and UN policy all contributed differently. The final result cannot be assigned to one actor without losing the mechanics.
And if we assign everything to foreign powers, we erase the soldiers who beat Lumumba and the Congolese politicians who wanted him removed.
No one is erasing them. We are asking who gave them the room to act and who benefited when they did.
The regime now faced a choice. It could put Lumumba on trial. A trial would create a public platform. Lumumba could speak. His supporters could mobilize. Foreign journalists could ask questions. The evidence used against him might expose the constitutional weakness of the coup and the foreign influence behind the new order. A trial could make him more powerful. It could turn the courtroom into another microphone. The alternative was indefinite detention. But indefinite detention carried its own risk. Prisons are not sealed from politics. Guards talk, families visit, messages move. A prisoner can become the center of a new rebellion. As long as Lumumba remained alive, his enemies had to manage the uncertainty of what he might say and who might act for him.
They were afraid of his voice even after they had taken the microphone away. And the prison mutiny would prove that the problem was not solved by walls.
In January 1961, unrest broke out among the troops guarding Camp Hardy. The details of the mutiny and the competing accounts of who controlled the prison require careful sourcing. But the strategic consequence is clear. The guards could no longer be assumed to remain loyal. If soldiers released Lumumba, he might return to the political arena. If they joined him, the military balance could shift. Mobutu's government and Belgian officials now faced a deadline. The prisoner had to be transferred. The proposed destination was Katanga. That choice was not administrative neutrality. Katanga was controlled by Moise Tshomba, the leader of the secessionist government Lumumba had opposed. It was also the region where Belgian influence remained strongest and where armed personnel hostile to Lumumba were operating. Sending him there meant placing him in the hands of people with every reason to fear his return.
The transfer is one of the strongest points in the evidence. The Belgian parliamentary inquiry concluded that Belgian representatives supported or organized the transfer to Katanga and failed to obtain guarantees for Lumumba's safety. That does not prove that every participant intended a firing squad execution. It does establish that the decision placed him in extreme danger.
And the distinction between knowledge and intention matters. You do not need to prove that every official wanted a specific method of killing to show that the transfer was reckless, unlawful, or politically calculated.
But the lack of a direct execution order still matters. Otherwise, we risk collapsing responsibility into a single conclusion before examining the final chain.
The absence of an order is part of the architecture of deniability. Different actors can say they only approved a transfer, a detention, or a security measure. The prisoner ends up with the people who kill him.
The road from Stanleyville to Katanga was more than a change of prison. It was a movement across the political map. In Leopoldville, Lumumba remained a national figure whose presence could attract attention. In Katanga, he would enter a territory structured around his defeat. The secessionist government had declared independence from the central state. Its leaders had rejected his authority. Belgian officers and mercenaries were present. The local administration had a direct interest in preventing Lumumba from returning to national politics. The transfer therefore functioned as a political solution disguised as a security decision. Remove him from the capital. move him beyond international visibility, deliver him to enemies who can control the outcome.
That is the interpretation most consistent with the evidence, but we should still label the final inference. The documents establish involvement in the transfer and the danger of the destination. They do not reveal every private intention held by every official.
The documentary can say that without weakening the conclusion. A chain of decisions can be criminally or morally significant even when the inner thoughts of every participant remain unknown.
The prison mutiny changed the urgency. Before, Lumumba was a dangerous prisoner. After, he was a prisoner who might be released by the men guarding him. That possibility alarmed Mobutu's government. It alarmed Belgian officials. It alarmed foreign governments that had already invested in his removal. The question was no longer whether the regime could contain him indefinitely. The question was whether it could move him before control collapsed. This is how deadlines turn political prisoners into cargo. The government does not need a new legal argument. It needs an aircraft, a destination, a receiving authority, and enough people willing to describe the operation as routine. Lumumba was not told that he was being sent to his execution in a formal announcement. He was moved through a process presented as transfer. The language was procedural. The consequences were existential. His enemies did not need to persuade the public that Katanga was safe. They only needed to make the movement appear like one more step in the management of a crisis. The legal question was pushed out of sight. The moral question was made technical. Who signed the transfer? Which authority had jurisdiction? Who would guard him? Were guarantees requested? What did the receiving government promise? In the spaces between those questions, responsibility dissolved.
This is how institutions hide violence in paperwork. No one writes, "We are sending a man to be killed." They write, "Transfer approved, non-disclosure required, security arrangements to follow. Local authorities will assume custody."
At Thisville, Lumumba remained a symbol even as his physical condition deteriorated. The man who had spoken about national dignity was now being moved by people who denied the political meaning of his office. His body had become evidence of the state's collapse. His survival had become an inconvenience. His death would become a risk. If he were killed secretly, the regime could deny responsibility. If he were tried publicly, he could speak. If he remained imprisoned, the guards might revolt. The transfer to Katanga offered a way to solve all three problems at once. It removed him from the capital. It reduced international scrutiny. And it placed him under the control of a government that wanted him gone.
The question is no longer whether Lumumba's enemies wanted him isolated. They had already isolated him. The question is whether the transfer was chosen because it was safe or because it was deniable.
The evidence strongly favors the second interpretation.
With one qualification, deniable does not automatically mean every participant knew the final outcome. It means the structure made responsibility easier to evade.
And that may have been precisely why it was chosen.
The plane would leave for Katanga in January. Lumumba would be joined by Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, two other senior Congolese figures whose presence made the transfer even more politically sensitive. The three men would not arrive as ordinary prisoners. They represented the national government that Katanga had rejected. Their transfer would bring the central conflict directly into the territory where secessionist power depended on foreign support. By then, the operation had moved beyond the question of whether Lumumba could return to office. It had become a question of whether anyone would ever see him alive again. There is a temptation to locate the true crime at the firing squad. That is where the bodies fall. But the machinery begins earlier. It begins when the elected government is denied the tools to govern, when a military coup is called neutrality, when a foreign intelligence service funds the force that suspends politics, when the UN protects a residence without protecting the political authority inside it, when a prisoner is beaten in public and the response is procedural silence, when a transfer to hostile territory is approved without meaningful guarantees. The final bullets matter. So do the decisions that made them possible. Lumumba's words had once crossed the walls of the Palais de la Nation. Now the people around him were trying to ensure that no new speech could reach the country. They would move him by air. They would take him to Katanga. And somewhere in the final hours of January 17, 1961, the language of transfer would end. What followed would be recorded in fragments, aircraft logs, witness testimony, diaries, official denials, and later confessions. The killing would be chaotic. The paperwork would be careful. A prime minister has been turned into a prisoner. A prisoner has been turned into a logistical problem, and a logistical problem is about to be delivered to the people who want him dead. January 17, 1961. Patrice Lumumba is no longer being treated as a former prime minister. He is cargo. His hands are tied. His body is damaged from weeks of imprisonment and abuse. With him are Maurice Mpolo, a senior Lumumbist figure, and Joseph Okito, vice president of the Senate. All three men are placed aboard an aircraft bound for Katanga. The official language is transfer. The political reality is delivery. Katanga is the breakaway province whose leaders have rejected the authority of the central government. It is protected by Belgian influence, supported by foreign personnel, and governed by men who understand that Lumumba's survival could threaten the entire secessionist project. The aircraft is not taking the prisoners away from danger. It is taking them toward the people most likely to destroy them.
The central question is now brutally narrow. Was this a prison transfer made by officials who failed to understand the danger, or was it a deliberate act of rendition to a hostile authority?
The evidence strongly supports deliberate transfer to a hostile political environment. The Belgian parliamentary inquiry found that Belgian representatives were involved in the decision and that no adequate guarantees for the prisoners' safety were obtained. But the inquiry did not establish a surviving written order from the Belgian government saying that the firing squad should execute Lumumba. That distinction remains essential.
The decision emerged from the crisis at Camp Hardy. The prison guards had mutinied or shown signs of unreliability. The men holding Lumumba could no longer be trusted to keep him contained. If the prisoners remained in Thisville, they might be released. Mobutu's government needed a solution. Belgian officials wanted Lumumba removed from the political field. Katanga's leaders wanted the central government's most prominent nationalist enemy in their hands. The transfer answered all three needs. It moved the prisoners away from the capital. It reduced the likelihood of a public trial. It placed them beyond the effective protection of the UN, and it gave local authorities the opportunity to decide their fate.
This is a classic architecture of deniability. The central government does not have to announce an execution. It transfers custody. The foreign power does not have to claim ownership. It facilitates movement. The receiving authority does not have to explain the political decision. It invokes local security. Each actor controls one part of the process. Together, they create an outcome no single actor needs to admit designing.
That is analytically persuasive, but we need to avoid treating deniability as proof of a murder plan. The transfer may have been intended to imprison Lumumba in a place where his enemies could control him, without a final decision having been made about execution.
If you send a prisoner to people who have every reason to kill him without safeguards, we had not decided yet, is not a defense.
It may not be a moral defense. It is still a factual question. We need to separate what the transfer shows from what it proves about the final killing.
The aircraft was an Air Congo DC-4. The men were taken aboard under guard. The flight itself became a zone of violence. Later testimony described Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito being beaten during the journey. Accounts differ over the precise sequence, the participants, and the extent of the violence. What is clear is that they did not arrive in Katanga as protected political prisoners. They arrived injured, bound, and under the authority of men who treated them as enemies. The aircraft crew reportedly objected when the beating threatened the safety of the flight. Even in that confined cabin, the logic of the operation remained visible. The prisoners' bodies were being damaged in transit. The destination was waiting. No judicial authority intervened. No neutral escort took custody. No guarantee of safety transformed the flight into a lawful transfer.
The testimony surrounding the flight must be handled carefully because much of it was recorded later and shaped by the political aftermath. but the broad evidence is consistent. Severe mistreatment occurred during the transfer, and Belgian-linked personnel were involved in the operation.
Were Belgian officers physically aboard the aircraft?
Belgian personnel were involved in the wider transfer and present in the Katangan operation. The exact composition of the flight crew and guards should be attributed to the specific record being used.
Good. Because Belgium flew him to his death is rhetorically powerful but potentially imprecise if the documentary does not identify which Belgian actors were present at each stage.
The chain is already strong without pretending every link has the same evidence grade.
As the aircraft moves south, the political geography changes beneath it. Leopoldville is behind them. The capital still contains the institutions of the Republic, however damaged. Katanga is different. It has declared itself separate. Its government is led by Moise Tshombe. Belgian advisors, officers, and mercenaries operate inside its security structure. Its economy is tied to the mineral companies that made the province so valuable. For Lumumba, the destination is not simply another prison. It is the territory that represents the defeat of national unity. If Leopoldville was the capital of the Congo's legal claim, Katanga was the center of the force trying to make that claim meaningless.
This is why geography is evidence. The transfer destination was not chosen at random. Katanga was the most politically hostile location available. The men sending Lumumba there knew the province's relationship to the central government. They knew Tshombe's position. They knew Belgian personnel were active there. The choice itself communicates risk.
Or it communicates practicality. Katanga had security forces willing to hold him. The central government had lost control of the prison.
Practicality can be political. The question is why that was the practical solution.
Because the people who could hold him were the people who wanted him gone.
The Belgian government had spent months denying direct involvement in Lumumba's removal. Officials could say that Congolese actors had arrested him. They could say the transfer was organized by the authorities in Leopoldville. They could say Katanga was responsible for what happened after landing. This distribution of responsibility was not accidental. The more fragmented the chain, the easier it became for every participant to describe their own action as limited. A minister could approve policy. A diplomat could send a cable. An intelligence officer could provide information. A military officer could arrange transport. A local government could receive the prisoners. A firing squad could carry out the killing. Afterward, everyone could point to someone else.
The 2001 Belgian inquiry rejected the idea that Belgium had merely watched events from the sidelines. Its conclusion was not that every Belgian official directly ordered the murder. Its conclusion was that certain Belgian government members and other Belgian participants bore moral responsibility for the circumstances leading to Lumumba's death. That is a carefully limited but devastating finding.
And it is stronger because the Commission did not claim more than it could prove. It did not turn moral responsibility into a fictional document. It showed how decisions accumulate.
One of the most important Belgian messages came from Foreign Minister Harold Dasbremont Linden. In October 1960, a cable referred to the definitive elimination of Lumumba. The wording has been debated. Did elimination mean political removal? Did it imply physical death? Was the ambiguity intentional? The phrase does not provide a complete operational order. It does, however, reveal the direction of Belgian policy. Lumumba was not being treated as a rival who might be defeated through elections. He was being treated as a problem that needed to disappear permanently.
When officials use language like definitive elimination, they know exactly what kind of world they are operating in. They are not discussing a newspaper correction. They are discussing a human being.
We still need to avoid translating political ambiguity into a specific murder command.
And we need to avoid translating murder language into harmless bureaucracy.
The productive conclusion is between those extremes. The cable is evidence of a policy to remove Lumumba permanently from political life. It is not, by itself, proof that the Belgian government issued the final firing squad order. That uncertainty must remain visible.
What about the United States? The CIA had already developed plans to assassinate Lumumba. Larry Devlin had received instructions and equipment connected to a poison plot. The CIA had supported Mobutu. The station had worked with Congolese authorities to obstruct Lumumba's escape. But whether Washington knew the precise destination and timing of the January transfer remains contested. Some research argues that CIA personnel were deeply involved in the chain that made the transfer possible. Other interpretations emphasize that the station's actions and knowledge may not map neatly onto a direct presidential or headquarters order. The distinction matters because covert operations are built to separate responsibility. A station chief may know more than headquarters. A local ally may act beyond the instructions received. A policy may authorize removal without specifying the method. The result can be fatal without producing a document that says exactly who approved each step.
Stephen Weissman's research argues that the CIA station chief was influential in the decision to render Lumumba to his enemies and may have withheld advance knowledge from policymakers who could have stopped the transfer. That is a serious scholarly argument. It should be presented as analysis of declassified records and testimony, not as an uncontested fact.
And the Church Committee's own record was more cautious. It documented assassination planning, but did not conclusively establish that the CIA killed Lumumba. The documentary must hold both findings.
The bigger lesson is that direct authorship is not the only form of responsibility. An agency can create pressure, support a regime, track a target, and fail to stop a lethal transfer. Each act can be defended separately. Together, they shape the outcome.
The aircraft approaches Katanga. Below it are the mining towns, rail routes, and company compounds that made the province central to the colonial economy. The men on board do not know whether they are being taken to a prison, a military tribunal, or something worse. Their guards know that the receiving authorities are hostile. The officials who arranged the transfer know that the destination is dangerous. The international community knows that Lumumba has been removed from the capital. The question is not whether danger exists, it is whether anyone will accept responsibility for it. The aircraft lands at Luano Airport near Elizabethville, the capital of Katanga. The prisoners are removed. The transfer is now complete. The chain has reached its final local authority. The men waiting for Lumumba are not neutral custodians. They are representatives of Tshombe's secessionist government and Belgian-backed security structures. The 3 prisoners are taken away from the airport. The details of the next hours are preserved through testimony, official records, later investigations, and the accounts of participants whose credibility has been contested. But the broad sequence is clear. Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito are moved toward a remote location. They are placed under the control of armed men. Belgian officers are involved. The prisoners are killed that night.
The execution site is generally identified as a clearing near Shiltembo. The date, January 17, 1961, is established. The participation of Katangan authorities and Belgian personnel is established in the broad record. The exact roles of individual officers and the precise sequence of the final moments require attribution.
And the question of command remains important. Were Belgian officers directing the operation, advising, supervising, present while Katangan forces carried it out?
The evidence points to direct Belgian involvement in the execution process, including the role of officers such as Julien Gatt and Franz Verscher. But the documentary should distinguish presence, command, and legal responsibility rather than using one word for all 3.
That distinction is where the final historical dispute lives. The killing was not necessarily a single-state operation in the conventional sense. It was a collaboration between local and foreign actors operating through a fractured sovereignty.
Which is precisely what made it useful to everyone involved.
The final journey had begun as a transfer. It ended as an execution. There was no public trial. No formal verdict, no opportunity for Lumumba to address the nation, no international observer with the authority to protect the prisoners. The legal government's former prime minister was killed inside the territory of a secessionist administration whose existence depended on foreign backing. The men who carried out the immediate violence could be described as local actors. The men who created the political conditions could describe themselves as advisors, allies, or administrators. The state that had once ruled the Congo could deny that it had ordered the killing. The superpower that had plotted against Lumumba could deny that its agents pulled the trigger. The machinery worked because responsibility was divided.
The bullets were local. The conditions were international.
That sentence is morally sharp, but it needs precision. The conditions were not only international. Congolese political rivalries mattered. Tshombe made decisions. Mobutu made decisions. Katangan forces participated. Belgian officials acted. American officials supported a political order designed to prevent Lumumba's return. The crime cannot be understood by removing Congolese agency. Nor can it be understood by pretending the Congolese actors operated outside foreign pressure. The assassination was not a simple foreign murder of an innocent population. It was a multinational operation carried out through local political and military structures. That complexity is not a reason to soften responsibility. It is the reason responsibility must be mapped. During the final hours, Lumumba was not protected by his office. The title of Prime Minister did not travel with him. The parliamentary mandate did not travel with him. The UN mission did not travel with him in any meaningful protective sense. Only the body remained. And even that would soon be treated as a problem. The men who killed Lumumba understood that a grave could become a monument. A monument could become a rallying point. A rallying point could become an uprising. The execution, therefore, created a second emergency. How do you kill a symbol without leaving a place where people can gather around him? The answer would involve a grave, a vehicle, tools, chemicals, and a decision to destroy the remains. But first, the killing itself. The documentary will not reconstruct the execution as graphic spectacle. The evidence is already horrifying. 3 men were taken to a clearing. They were placed before a firing squad. Belgian personnel were present and involved in the process. They were shot. The act was recorded not as a public political event, but as a technical conclusion to a prisoner transfer, a life reduced to a line in a diary, a government reduced to a body in the dirt, an entire nation's crisis compressed into a few minutes of violence.
This is where the famous notation 943L Dude becomes important if the diary source is authenticated and accurately translated. The precision is chilling. The exact time gives bureaucratic form to a political killing. But the notation does not tell us everything about command or motive.
A timestamp proves that someone recorded a death. It does not prove who ordered it.
No, but it shows how quickly murder can become administration.
The killing did not end the uncertainty. It multiplied it. The authorities could not safely announce the truth immediately. They needed a story. For a time, official accounts suggested that Lumumba had disappeared or been killed by local forces beyond Belgian control. The facts were delayed. The bodies were hidden. The families were left without certainty. The international community received fragments. In Leopoldville, Pauline did not yet have a body to bury. In Stanleyville, Lumumbists had to decide whether to continue resistance. In capitals around the world, protests would soon erupt. But in Katanga, the men responsible faced a practical problem. A grave was evidence. A grave could be found. A grave could become sacred. They needed to make Patrice Lumumba physically disappear.
The transfer has answered one question. It was not a neutral relocation. It delivered Lumumba and his companions into the custody of their political enemies, with Belgian involvement and no meaningful guarantee of safety. But it leaves us with the most disturbing question yet. Why was killing not enough?
The answer begins the next morning. The men who had carried out the execution returned to the problem of the bodies. The grave is shallow. The story is unstable. The political consequences are growing. And a Belgian police officer named Gerard Soet will later describe what happened next, not as a secret buried forever, as a confession made decades later in a comfortable European home with pieces of Lumumba's body displayed before a camera. The aircraft had carried 3 prisoners into Katanga. By dawn, it had carried the last chance of a public trial out of history. The night of January 17, 1961, begins after the aircraft lands in Katanga. Patrice Lumumba is 35 years old. Maurice Mpolo is a senior political and military figure. Joseph Okito is vice president of the Senate. All three men have been transferred from a prison controlled by Mobutu's forces to a province ruled by Moise Tshombe's secessionist government. They are not brought before a court. They are not questioned in public. They are not placed under neutral protection. They are taken away from the airport. The road leads toward a remote clearing near Shiltembo. The prisoners have entered the final stage of a process that began with a constitutional dispute and ended with a destination chosen by their enemies. The exact sequence of the last hours is reconstructed from Belgian parliamentary investigations, testimony, memoirs, official records, and later accounts by participants. Those sources do not agree on every detail. They differ over who spoke, who gave which order, how the prisoners were handled, and which officers exercised command at each moment. But the central facts are established. Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito were executed in Katanga on January 17, 1961. Belgian personnel were involved. Katangan authorities participated. The killing was followed by an organized effort to conceal the bodies and deny what had happened.
We have reached the point where the question cannot be answered with one name. Who killed Lumumba? The firing squad, the officers supervising it, the Katangan government that received him, the Belgian officials who helped send him there, the foreign governments that supported the political order surrounding the transfer. The answer depends on whether we mean who fired, who ordered, who enabled, or who benefited.
And those categories must not be collapsed. The available evidence establishes direct involvement by multiple actors, but the precise legal responsibility of each person is not identical. A documentary should be morally clear without pretending the archive is clearer than it is.
The clearing near Shiltembo is far from the ceremonial rooms where independence had been celebrated 7 months earlier. There is no microphone, no parliament, no diplomatic audience, no official record of a trial. Only armed men, 3 prisoners, and a political decision that has been pushed beyond public view. The setting matters because the killing is often remembered as though it were a single secret act. It was secret from the public. It was not isolated from the institutions that had produced the prisoners' vulnerability. The men arrived there because a chain of state decisions had removed them from the capital, stripped them of protection, and placed them under Katangan control. The clearing was the final location. It was not the beginning.
This distinction is central to understanding covert violence. The visible act happens at the end of a pipeline. Before the rifle is raised, someone must identify the target, isolate the target, transport the target, assign custody, restrict information, and decide what happens afterward. The shooting is only one stage.
And the people who focus exclusively on the trigger often do it because the trigger is the easiest place to stop looking.
The prisoners are believed to have been accompanied by Katangan soldiers and Belgian officers. Among the Belgian personnel associated with the execution were Julien Gat and Franz Verscheur. The exact role of each officer remains a matter of historical reconstruction. Was one directing the operation? Were they supervising local forces? Were they acting as advisors? Were they present because Belgian personnel controlled security in Katanga? The answers matter. But presence in a chain of custody is not neutral when the prisoners are delivered to a hostile authority without safety guarantees.
Let's pause on the phrase, commanded by Belgian officers. It appears frequently in summaries of the case, but it can conceal uncertainty about the exact command structure. What is the evidence for direct command?
The Belgian parliamentary inquiry and later research established the presence and involvement of Belgian officers in the execution process. Some accounts identify Gat and Verscheur as directing or supervising the firing squad. The careful wording is that Belgian officers were directly involved in the execution and that Belgian responsibility extended beyond passive presence. Whether one officer issued the final verbal command is less firmly documented.
That is the wording we need. The state's responsibility does not depend on inventing a transcript of the final order.
The 3 men were killed. The accounts describe a firing squad, a tree or wooded clearing, and a sequence of shots. The documentary will not stage the execution as graphic spectacle. The violence is not made more truthful by describing every wound. What matters is the political fact of the killing. A prime minister was removed from office through military force, captured after an escape attempt, transferred to the territory of a secessionist government, and executed without trial. 2 other senior Congolese officials were killed with him. The act did not restore order. It removed a political alternative.
The strongest contrarian argument is that the killing emerged from a civil war, not from a single colonial command. Deshambi's government saw Lumumba as an enemy. Congolese forces carried out the immediate violence. Belgian personnel may have acted as advisors or supervisors. The United States opposed Lumumba but did not necessarily direct the final execution. That makes the murder a product of local and international conflict, not a simple foreign assassination.
A civil war does not erase the foreign soldiers, money, intelligence, and political support operating inside it.
No, but it does prevent us from turning every Congolese participant into a passive instrument.
The best account includes both. Local actors had agency. Foreign actors shaped the environment and supported the forces that benefited from Lumumba's removal.
The killing created an immediate problem for everyone involved. Lumumba was dead, but his body remained. A grave would create a location. A location would create memory. A memory could become a shrine. A shrine could become a political center. The men who had feared Lumumba alive now feared what his remains might do after death. A public burial could transform the execution into a rallying point for national resistance. The body had to disappear. That decision reveals something important about the killer's understanding of politics. They were not only trying to remove a man, they were trying to prevent the Congolese people from possessing a place where his death could be mourned and contested.
This is why the cover-up is not an afterthought. The body is a political asset. A government can control a prisoner. It cannot easily control a martyr's grave. Destroying the remains was an attempt to destroy future mobilization.
They wanted to kill memory by attacking the evidence.
The first burial was temporary. The bodies were placed in the ground in or near the area of the execution, but a shallow grave could be discovered. Local people might find it. Supporters might come looking. The political story could escape the control of the Katangan authorities. The decision was made to exhume the remains. The subsequent accounts describe an operation involving Belgian police officials, Gerard Soete, and his brother. Soete later confessed that the bodies were removed, dismembered, and destroyed using acid. His 1999 television appearance made the cover-up public decades after the event. He described the process with a chilling lack of remorse and displayed teeth he said had belonged to Lumumba. That confession is evidence. It is not a perfect record. A participant confessing 40 years later may exaggerate, misremember, or shape the story for attention. But the confession aligns with the broader fact that Lumumba's body was deliberately destroyed and that Belgium eventually returned a tooth, believed to be his only known surviving remains.
The tooth is important, but we should not pretend it independently verifies every detail of Sowete's story. What it verifies is that a physical remnant existed, was retained, and was later returned. The exact sequence of dismemberment and acid disposal comes primarily through testimony.
Correct. The 2001 inquiry and later investigations support the conclusion that the bodies were deliberately concealed and destroyed. Sowete's account supplies the most vivid details.
The time of death is associated with a brief entry in Franz Verscher's diary, 9043 L. Dude. The notation is often translated as 9043 L. Dead. It is one of the most haunting fragments in the entire case. A man who had become a symbol of African independence is reduced to a time and an initial. No speech, no explanation, no admission of political responsibility. Just a line in a diary.
If the diary is authenticated and the translation is accurate, the entry gives us a precise timestamp for the killing. It does not, by itself, establish who ordered the execution or what was said before it. But the bureaucratic tone tells us something about the mentality of the record. A death that would shake the world is written as a routine operational fact.
Or as a private note by an individual trying to document what happened. We should not infer an entire institutional culture from one line.
One line is enough to show how power records death. The victim's life is decades of struggle. The killer's record is 6 words.
The diary entry is powerful precisely because it is so small. Historical crimes often survive through fragments: a cable, a photograph, a prison record, a diary line, a tooth. Each object is incomplete. Together, they form a pattern. The pattern does not answer every question. It does establish that the official story of a spontaneous disappearance was false. Lumumba did not vanish into the jungle. He did not simply die in an unrecorded local clash. He was transported, executed, and concealed. The state actors involved then relied on distance, secrecy, and divided responsibility.
The killing happened at 9043, if the diary entry is accepted. But responsibility did not begin at 9043. It began when officials made the decision to place Lumumba in the hands of people who had the motive and opportunity to kill him.
That is the central moral distinction between the final act and the chain that produced it.
News of Lumumba's death did not reach the public immediately. The authorities delayed confirmation. Rumors spread. Supporters feared the worst. Foreign governments tried to manage the consequences. The delay was not only about uncertainty, it was about narrative control. A confirmed assassination of the Congo's first prime minister would expose the political meaning of the transfer. It would raise questions about Belgium's role. It would intensify criticism of the United Nations. It would validate Lumumba's warnings about foreign interference. It could also ignite unrest across Africa and beyond. Silence was therefore a form of containment. The longer the truth remained unclear, the longer officials could negotiate their public accounts.
The body was hidden because the truth was dangerous. The truth was hidden because the politics were dangerous. The politics were dangerous because people understood what Lumumba represented.
The first official explanations attempted to distance the central actors from the killing. Belgium denied responsibility for Lumumba's arrest, transfer, and death. Katangan authorities could portray the event as the result of local conflict. The United States could point to the absence of CIA officers at the firing squad. The UN could point to its mandate and the limits of its authority. Each statement might contain a narrow technical defense. None answered the larger question. Why was Lumumba sent to Katanga? Why were no safety guarantees secured? Why were Belgian personnel involved? Why did the international system fail to protect a prime minister whose government had invited its presence?
This is where the phrase, "who gave the final order," can become misleading. A final order is important, but if the system is organized so that nobody needs to issue one explicit command, the search for a single sentence may become a way of avoiding shared responsibility.
Or it may prevent us from blaming people for an order they never gave. The historical discipline is to hold both possibilities open.
And to ask what remains proven, even if the sentence is never found.
What remains proven is substantial. Lumumba was removed through a coup supported by foreign intelligence. He was confined and captured after an escape attempt. He was transferred to Katanga. Belgian officials and personnel were involved in the circumstances of that transfer and in the events surrounding the execution. The prisoners were killed without trial. Their bodies were concealed and destroyed. The Belgian state later accepted moral responsibility for the circumstances leading to Lumumba's death. The precise final authorization remains unresolved. That unresolved point should not become an escape hatch. History is not only about identifying the person who spoke the last command. It is also about identifying the decisions without which the crime could not have happened. The men who killed Lumumba believed the body had to disappear. They were right about one thing. A grave would have changed the story. A grave would have given Congolese families a place to mourn. A grave would have given political movements a place to gather. A grave would have made the assassination visible in a permanent way. So the executioners tried to make the dead man unavailable. But the erasure produced another kind of evidence. The missing body became a question. The question became a campaign. The campaign became a demand for documents, testimony, accountability, and remains. The state tried to eliminate the object. It could not eliminate the absence.
This is the paradox of authoritarian erasure. Destroying the body does not necessarily destroy the memory. Sometimes it makes the missing body the center of the memory. The absence becomes proof that someone was afraid of what the body could mean.
For Pauline Lumumba, the